There is a place at the very top of the world where the sea never freezes, where iron-grey water sits so still on winter mornings that the surface looks like polished stone, where the mountains fall directly into the fjord, steep and dark and silent, and where the sky in April can be so overcast that dawn and dusk are barely an hour apart. This is Narvik, a town carved into the edge of Norway's Arctic coast, connected by a single railway to the iron ore fields of Sweden, and in the spring of 1940, connected to the fate of an entire war. Most people, when they think of the Second World War, think of Normandy. They think of the deserts of North Africa, the Eastern Front, the long, slow grind of the Pacific. They do not think of a fjord in northern Norway, 350 kilometers north of the Arctic Circle, where a collection of warships fought a battle that would decide whether Germany could keep its industry running. But they should. Because what happened at Narvik between the 9th of April and the 8th of June, 1940, changed the mathematics of the entire war in ways that historians are still calculating. This is the complete story. Not the short version, not the summary, the full account from the first intelligence whispers in Berlin and London, through the iron ore politics that set everything in motion, through the two naval battles that shook the Kriegsmarine to its core, through the weeks of mountain fighting that became something close to legend on both sides, and through the evacuation that ended it all, an ending that was less a defeat and more a postponement of grief. We are going to move slowly tonight. That is by design. Long-form history deserves long-form telling. The kind of telling where you can feel the cold coming off the screen, where you understand not just what happened, but why it had to happen, why these particular men in this particular place were always going to collide. By the time this is over, you will know Narvik the way you know a place you have been to not read about, but actually stood in, wind against your face, the weight of it real in your chest. So settle in, find a comfortable position, let the narration carry you, and if you fall asleep somewhere along the way, this story will still be here when you wake up. It always will be. Music shifts. Low cello, slow tempo, almost like breathing. If you are finding value in this kind of deep, unhurried history, consider subscribing and leaving a comment below. It genuinely helps this channel continue making these long-form documentaries. Tell us, had you heard of the Battle of Narvik before tonight? Because if the answer is no, you are not alone, and that is precisely why we made this. Chapter 1. The town at the end of the railway. Long before anyone fired a single shot, before a single destroyer moved through the darkness of Ofotfjord, Narvik was already one of the most strategically significant places in the world, not because of its size. In 1940, it was a modest port town, home to only a few thousand residents, pressed between mountains and water in a way that left almost no flat ground for the kind of expansion that industrial towns usually grow into. Its streets climbed steeply away from the waterfront. Its winters were brutal, prolonged, and dark in ways that people from temperate climates struggle to fully picture. And yet, for all its smallness, Narvik sat at the convergence point of two realities that together made it irreplaceable. The first reality was geological. Beneath the mountains of northern Sweden, near the towns of Kiruna and Malmberget, lay some of the richest iron ore deposits in the world. Not just iron ore in the ordinary sense, but high-grade ore, the kind that produced steel of exceptional quality. Germany's armaments industry in 1939 depended on a steady supply of this ore to keep its factories running, not to supplement production, not to bolster reserves, to keep the lights on. Without Swedish iron ore, the rate of German steel production would have dropped to a level that could not sustain a modern war effort. The second reality was geographical. During the summer months, ships carrying ore from Sweden could travel through the Baltic Sea from the Swedish port of Luleå on the Gulf of Bothnia, reaching Germany by a relatively direct route. But in winter, when the Gulf of Bothnia froze over, that route closed completely. The alternative was to carry the ore by rail westward across the Scandinavian mountain range, the spine of the peninsula, and load it at Narvik, which sat on a fjord that, because of the warming influence of the Atlantic, never froze. From Narvik, the ore ships would then travel south down the Norwegian coast, sheltered inside territorial waters, before crossing to German ports. This meant that for roughly half of every year, the cold half, the dark half, the half that mattered most. Logistically, Narvik was the single most important choke point in Germany's industrial supply chain. 40% of Germany's iron ore requirements passed through this one small harbour. Winston Churchill understood this with perfect clarity. He wrote and later said publicly that the effective stoppage of iron ore supplies to Germany via the Norwegian transit should be considered one of the most important operations of the war. He was not exaggerating for rhetorical effect. He was doing arithmetic. And the Germans understood it too. Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, commander of the German Navy, had been watching the Norwegian situation with mounting anxiety through the winter of 1939 into 1940. He worried correctly that the British would eventually move to interdict the ore route. He worried about British submarines operating in Norwegian waters. He worried about the possibility of Norway, nominally neutral, drifting toward Allied alignment, and he brought these worries to Adolf Hitler, not once but repeatedly, in the early months of 1940, building a case that Norway could not be allowed to remain in a condition of comfortable neutrality if Germany was going to win the war it had started. What made Narvik especially vulnerable from the German perspective was its isolation. The town was connected by rail to Sweden, but had no railway connection to the rest of Norway. The road network in that part of the country was sparse and, in winter, frequently impassable. If a hostile force seized Narvik and held the surrounding territory, the German garrison there would have no easy land route for resupply or reinforcement. This geographic reality, which the Germans knew and nevertheless accepted, would later define everything about the land battle that followed the naval engagements. The town that the Germans needed to hold was, almost by design, a town nearly impossible to hold. For the civilian population of Narvik in the winter of 1939 to 1940, the war was still largely an abstraction. News came by radio, rationing was being discussed. Norwegian men of military age were registered and some were training, though the Norwegian armed forces' honest appraisals acknowledge were not prepared for the scale of what was coming. The government in Oslo watched the great powers maneuver around their country with a combination of diplomatic dexterity and genuine alarm. Norway had been neutral in the First World War. There was a national instinct, deeply felt, that neutrality was the only reasonable posture for a small country flanked by powerful and volatile neighbours. That instinct was about to meet reality. The ore ships moved through Narvik's harbour through the winter months of 1939 to 1940 with the quiet regularity of commerce. Trains arrived from Sweden, ore was loaded, ships departed southward. The machinery of trade, indifferent to the ideologies fighting over its outputs, continued its rhythms. But in London and Berlin, planners were sketching maps, calculating timing, arguing about weather windows and naval dispositions. The ordinary life of Narvik, the dockyards, the small cafes, the fishermen who had nothing to do with iron ore at all, was being quietly circled on strategic charts by men who had never visited. This is how wars always begin their approach, from far away in rooms the people most affected will never see. By the early spring of 1940, the window for a decisive move was narrowing. The Baltic would thaw within weeks, restoring the summer ore route and reducing Narvik's strategic weight. If either side was going to act, it had to act before the ice broke. In London, Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, not yet Prime Minister, was pushing hard for an operation to mine Norwegian coastal waters and deny Germany the sheltered shipping lane it relied on. In Berlin, Raeder and the Wehrmacht's planning staff were working on something far more ambitious. Not merely an interdiction, but a complete seizure. Not just of Narvik, but of Norway. All of it. Simultaneously. In a single night. Both sides were moving toward the same fjord from opposite directions. One of them would arrive first. And in the fog and the cold of an early April morning, the two plans would collide in a way that neither capital had fully anticipated. Chapter 2. The plans that would change everything. The operation that Germany was developing through the winter months of 1939 to 1940 was, by any honest military assessment, extraordinarily audacious, perhaps recklessly so. The plan, eventually codenamed Operation Weserübung, a name that translates roughly as Weser exercise, with a bureaucratic blandness that disguised its radical ambition, called for the simultaneous seizure of all of Norway's major ports, stretching from Oslo in the south to Narvik in the north, across a distance of roughly 2,000 kilometers of coastline. It also called for the simultaneous occupation of Denmark. All of this was to be done in a single, coordinated operation on a single night with near-perfect timing. The sheer geographic scale of what the Germans were proposing had no real precedent. They were planning to project naval and ground forces across hundreds of kilometers of open sea simultaneously, against a country that had not been attacked and had no expectation of being attacked. Before the Allies could respond, the entire operation depended on surprise. Not tactical surprise, of the kind where one unit catches another off guard. Operational surprise at the strategic level, the kind where an entire country goes to bed in peacetime and wakes up occupied. Raeder knew this was the knife edge on which the plan balanced. Any significant intelligence leak, any early detection by Royal Navy patrols, and the whole thing fell apart. For the Narvik portion of the operation, 10 destroyers were assigned to carry the mountain infantry who would seize and hold the port. These were not surplus vessels scraped together for a secondary mission. They represented a substantial fraction of Germany's entire operational destroyer strength. The mountain troops they would carry belonged to the 3rd Mountain Division Elite Infantry, trained specifically for the kind of cold-weather, high-altitude warfare that the Norwegian terrain would demand. Commanding the ground element at Narvik was General Eduard Dietel, a Bavarian officer with a gift for improvisation and an ability to project calm that his men found stabilizing in exactly the kind of situations designed to produce panic. On the British side, planning was proceeding along a different track and with considerably less coordination. Churchill's proposal for mining Norwegian coastal waters had been debated, delayed, argued over, and postponed through late March and into early April. The French had concerns. There were legal and diplomatic questions about violating Norwegian neutrality, even in service of a strategy designed to protect Norway from something far worse. The date for the mining operation, eventually called Operation Wilfred, was pushed back from the 5th of April to the 8th of April. That delay of 3 days, which seemed at the time like a minor administrative adjustment, would prove to be one of the most consequential scheduling decisions of the war. While the Allies debated, the German fleet was already preparing to sail. On the 6th of April, 1940, the 10 destroyers earmarked for Narvik carrying Dietel's mountain troops began their loading at the port of Wesermunde. An observer at the Long Columbus Pier that day would have seen company after company of mountain infantry boarding the ships, carrying the heavy equipment of soldiers trained for difficult terrain, machine guns, mortars, the particular weight of men who expected to fight in places that had no roads. The destroyers sat low in the water under the load. Their journey north would take them through waters where British submarines and surface patrols were already operating. Every hour of the voyage was a gamble. The German naval force for the entire Norwegian operation was commanded by Grand Admiral Raeder, but the tactical execution was in the hands of the various flotilla and group commanders. For the Narvik destroyer group, the senior officer was Commodore Friedrich Bonte, whose flagship was the destroyer Wilhelm Heidkamp. Bonte was experienced, professional, and realistic about what his orders required. He understood that once his destroyers reached Narvik and landed Dietel's troops, they faced a severe problem. They would be deep inside a Norwegian fjord, hundreds of kilometers from any German-controlled port, with fuel running low and no facility at Narvik capable of adequately replenishing destroyers of their size. The exit strategy was an assumption rather than a plan. In London, on the 7th of April, intelligence reports began arriving that suggested the German fleet was moving. Ships had been sighted at sea, heading north. The Admiralty debated what this meant. Some analysts believed Germany was attempting to break out into the Atlantic, a concern that had dominated British naval thinking for months. The possibility that the fleet was heading for Norway was considered, but not acted on with sufficient urgency. Forces were repositioned, but not in ways that would intercept the German convoy routes to the northern ports. When the 8th of April arrived, and the British mining operation in Norwegian waters finally began, it was already hours behind the German timetable. On the night of the 8th of April, moving into the 9th, the German fleet executed its plan. The operation that had been rehearsed and planned and worried over through months of winter preparation began playing out across the entire length of a country that did not yet understand what was happening to it. Ships moved in darkness. Troops landed on wharves and beaches. The Norwegian coastal defences in many places were simply overwhelmed before they could organise a coherent response. At Narvik, the Norwegian garrison was small, and the arrival of a force of destroyers in the early morning hours caught the defenders in exactly the state of disorganisation that Raeder had counted on. By the morning of the 9th of April, Narvik was in German hands. What the Germans had not fully solved was what to do next. Dietl had his town, his port, his railway connection to Sweden. But his destroyers, the ships that had brought him there, the ships that were his only connection to the naval chain of command, were still in the fjord, unable to leave because they lacked the fuel for the return journey. The ore loading facility at Narvik was not equipped to transfer fuel to warships. A tanker had been planned as part of the operation's logistics, but it had not arrived. The ships sat in the harbour and in the surrounding fjords, running low on fuel, waiting for a solution that was slower in arriving than anyone had planned. This was the window that would define everything that followed. The Germans had taken Narvik in a single morning, but they were about to discover that taking a place and holding it are two entirely different problems, and that the sea route home was not as open as it had appeared on a planning map in Berlin. Chapter 3. The Man Who Went Anyway. Captain Bernard Warburton Lee was not, on paper, the most obvious choice for the moment that history assigned to him. He was a destroyer captain capable, respected, experienced in the specific operational rhythms of the Royal Navy's surface forces, but not a flag officer, not a man with the broad authority to shape campaigns or override his superiors at will. He was a man who worked within his orders, who understood the chain of command, and who had spent a career learning the difference between calculated risk and recklessness. On the 9th of April, 1940, he was given information that would have caused many officers to pause, reconsider, and request further guidance before proceeding. He paused, he reconsidered. He sent his request for guidance, and then, when the answer came back, he went anyway. Warburton Lee commanded the 2nd Destroyer Flotilla, 5 destroyers, HMS Hardy, HMS Hunter, HMS Havoc, HMS Hostile, and HMS Hotspur. He received orders to proceed to Narvik and assess the situation. As his ships moved northward toward the entrance to Ofotfjord on the 9th of April, he received intelligence that the Germans were holding the town in significantly greater force than initial reports had suggested. The local Norwegian pilot station at the fjord entrance told him there were at least 6 German destroyers at Narvik, possibly more, and that the channel might be mined. This information materially changed the calculation. He had 5 ships. The enemy had at least 6, probably more, in confined waters where manoeuvre was limited and surprise was the only real equalizer. He sent a signal to the Admiralty, laying out the situation with complete clarity. He reported the enemy strength estimate. He reported the possible mining of the channel. He stated his intention, to attack at dawn. The Admiralty's reply, when it came, has become one of the quiet landmarks in the recorded history of naval decision-making. It said, in effect, "You alone can judge whether to attack, and whatever decision you make will have full support." The Admiralty was not pushing him forward. It was not overriding his judgment. It was handing the decision back to the man on the scene, the man who could see the sky, feel the wind, read the quality of the darkness over Ofotfjord, and saying, "This is yours." He chose to attack. He timed his approach for just before 4 o'clock in the morning on the 10th of April, leading Hardy, Hunter, and Havoc into the inner harbour, while Hostile and Hotspur waited at the fjord entrance as a covering force. What favoured him, beyond his own nerve, was the weather. A heavy snowstorm had settled over the fjord during the night. Visibility dropped to near nothing. The snow that made the approach uncomfortable and disorienting for his crews made his ships effectively invisible to any German lookout ashore or on the anchored destroyers. He arrived off Narvik, a fjord he had never navigated before, in darkness, in a snowstorm at just before 4 in the morning, and the Germans did not see him coming. The attack that followed was swift. With torpedoes and gunfire, Warburton Lee's 3 destroyers struck the German ships in the harbour. The Wilhelm Heidkamp Commodore Bonte's flagship took a torpedo and went down. Bonte was killed. The Anton Schmidt was also sunk. 3 other German destroyers took significant damage. The British also fired torpedoes at the merchant ships crowded in the harbour, sinking a number of vessels loaded with military supplies. For a few extraordinary minutes, 5 British destroyers had walked into a harbour guarded by superior forces and inflicted damage that should, by any reasonable accounting, have been impossible. The element of surprise, combined with the skill of the gunnery and the violence of the torpedo attacks, had given Warburton Lee a result that exceeded his most optimistic calculations. The problem was the return journey. As Warburton Lee's flotilla withdrew back down the fjord toward the open sea, they encountered the 5 German destroyers that had been sheltering in the neighbouring side fjords during the night vessels, whose presence the intelligence reports had noted, but whose exact positions had not been confirmed. These destroyers were armed with guns heavier than anything on the British ships, and they were fresh, unfired, positioned across the escape route. The engagement that followed was not a continuation of the surprise attack, it was a rearguard action, a fighting withdrawal, and it was brutal in the way that rearguard actions in confined spaces always are. HMS Hardy was hit. Warburton Lee was on the bridge when a shell struck it directly. He was mortally wounded. His last signal passed by his surviving crew before they managed to beach the stricken Hardy on the fjord shore were 4 words: "Continue to engage the enemy." HMS Hunter was also sunk in the withdrawal. HMS Hotspur was damaged. The surviving ships broke through and cleared the fjord, carrying their dead and their wounded, and the knowledge that they had done something significant, even if the final accounting was not yet clear. Behind them, the wreckage of 5 sunken ships, 2 British, 2 German, 1 later beached, lay in the cold water of Ofotfjord. Back in London, the results of the First Battle of Narvik were assessed with the careful arithmetic of naval planning. 2 German destroyers confirmed sunk, 3 others heavily damaged, a number of supply ships destroyed against the loss of 2 British destroyers and 1 mortally wounded flotilla commander. On paper, the action was what tacticians call a drawn battle, costly for both sides, with the attacker perhaps marginally ahead. But that cold accounting missed something that the numbers could not convey. The German destroyers left in the fjord were now in a terrible position. They were trapped. Their fuel situation, already critical before the attack, was now worse. Their ammunition had been consumed, their senior officer was dead, and the British were not finished. Warburton Lee received the Victoria Cross posthumously. He was 44 years old. The citation noted his gallantry, enterprise, and daring, the trifecta of naval courage. But what it did not say, what no citation could fully capture, was the quality of the moment he faced on the night of the 9th of April. The moment when the information said the odds were worse than expected, when the Admiralty handed the decision back to him, and when he looked at what he had and decided it was enough. In the history of the Second World War, courage is easy to find. Judgment is rarer. Warburton Lee had both, in the right proportion, at the right moment. 3 days later, the British would return to finish what he had started. Chapter 4. The Warspite Goes In. If the First Battle of Narvik had been a raid fast, dangerous, improvised, dependent on darkness and snowstorm, then the Second Battle of Narvik was something different in character altogether. It was deliberate. It was prepared. It brought the kind of naval weight that transforms tactical engagements into strategic conclusions. Vice Admiral William Whitworth had spent the 3 days between the battles reviewing what Warburton Lee had found, assessing the German position, and assembling a force that would be, by every calculation, sufficient. What he assembled was HMS Warspite, a Queen Elizabeth-class battleship, displacing 31,000 tons, armed with 8 15-inch guns accompanied by 9 destroyers. He was going back to Ofotfjord, and this time there would be no withdrawal. Sending a battleship of Warspite's size into a Norwegian fjord was not a decision taken lightly. The water was deep enough. Technically, fjords tend to be, but the navigational margins in a confined channel were uncomfortably tight for a vessel of that length and beam. There were concerns about torpedoes from German destroyers operating in shallow water ambush positions along the fjord walls. There were concerns about shore batteries that the Germans might have established in the days since the first battle. And there were concerns that the Luftwaffe, operating from bases further south in Norway, would contest the approach from the air. Whitworth judged that these concerns, while real, were outweighed by the certainty of the outcome if Warspite's guns could reach the remaining German destroyers at close range. He was right. The Second Battle of Narvik began on the 13th of April, 1940, when Whitworth's force entered Ofotfjord at around 12:30 in the afternoon. One of the early decisions to pay dividends was the use of a Fairey Swordfish aircraft, a biplane torpedo bomber. Slow and ungainly by modern standards, launched from Warspite's catapult to scout ahead up the fjord and into the side channels. The Swordfish pilot located the German submarine U-64, sheltering in Herjangsfjord, a tributary inlet off the main fjord. The aircraft attacked and sank it, one of the earliest successful anti-submarine air attacks of the entire war. It was also, in its small way, a signal of what the day was going to look like for anything German that was still in these waters. The German destroyers, those that remained, were in a desperate condition. Their fuel was critically low, in some cases effectively exhausted. Their ammunition reserves had been heavily drawn down in the first battle and in the days of defensive activity that followed. The crews had been living aboard anchored ships in an Arctic fjord in April, waiting for a relief that had not come and watching the sky with the specific anxiety of men who know the next attack is coming and have limited means to meet it. When Warspite and her 9 accompanying destroyers appeared in the main fjord, the German commanders made the only decision available to them. They would fight rearguard actions and then withdraw as deeply into the fjord system as they could go, hoping that the geography would grant them some protection, or at least some time. What followed was not a battle in the conventional sense, 2 forces maneuvering for advantage, each capable of defeating the other. It was a destruction. The German destroyers, outgunned and outfueled, were engaged throughout the length of Ofotfjord and into the side channels. Some were sunk in action. Others, their machinery failing or their ammunition spent, were beached and abandoned by their crews. The final group retreated all the way into Rombaksfjord, the innermost reach of the fjord system, a narrow arm of water that narrowed further toward its head, where they made their last stand and were scuttled by their own crews rather than be captured. All 8 German destroyers remaining in the fjord at the start of the second battle were destroyed or scuttled. Not one escaped. HMS Eskimo had its bow torn off by a torpedo during the action, a wound that should, by any reasonable assessment, have sent it to the bottom. That it did not, that the crew managed the flooding and kept the ship afloat through the remainder of the engagement and the withdrawal, was one of the quiet demonstrations of seamanship that run through this battle as a thread. The British took their share of damage, but they took it without losing a ship. The disproportion between the 2 sides' losses in the second battle was almost absolute. The Kriegsmarine's destroyer arm was broken. Within 4 days in a single fjord, Germany had lost 10 destroyers, a loss that amounted to roughly half of the German Navy's total destroyer strength. The significance of this loss was not felt immediately, in the way that a city's fall is felt immediately. It accumulated. In the months that followed, as the war in the West reached its crisis point, the German Navy would find itself unable to support operations that would have required destroyer escorts it no longer possessed. When Hitler considered an invasion of Britain in the summer of 1940, the operation known as Sea Lion, the Navy's assessment was that the remaining German surface fleet was insufficient to protect the invasion. Convoys from the Royal Navy. The losses at Narvik were among the reasons for that insufficiency. The battle in the fjord had reached forward in time and constrained options that would not even become options for another several months. For the German troops ashore at Narvik, the sight of those ships going to the bottom, their ships, the ships that had brought them here, the ships they had assumed were their connection to everything they depended on, was one of the defining moments of the campaign. Dietl and his mountain troops were now, effectively, on their own. No destroyer force was going to come back up Ofotfjord for a resupply run. No retreat by sea was possible. The railway east towards Sweden was the only remaining connection to the outside world, and even that was contested. The men who had come here as part of a bold amphibious operation were now simply a garrison cut off, surrounded, and facing an enemy force that was growing larger every day. Back in Berlin, the news from Narvik arrived on the 13th of April with a weight that the official bulletins could not quite conceal. 10 destroyers. Gone. The naval leadership absorbed this in the particular silence that follows catastrophic loss. Hitler, whose relationship with the Kriegsmarine was always complicated by his army general's instincts about land power, would later tell Dietl personally that he had considered ordering a withdrawal and that only Dietl's own signals of continued resistance had changed his mind. Whether this is accurate or not, it is at least true that the isolation of Narvik, the loss of the naval lifeline, transformed what had been a component of a broader strategic operation into something else entirely. Something that would have to be resolved on land, in the mountains, over weeks of fighting that nobody in Berlin had planned for, and nobody in London had expected to be as hard as it turned out to be. The fjord was quiet again after the 13th. The wrecks settled, and in the town above the waterline, General Dietl began making his calculations. Chapter 5. Dietls Mountain. The situation General Eduard Dietl found himself in during the weeks following the destruction of the German destroyer fleet was, by the standards of conventional military planning, something close to untenable. He had roughly 2,000 mountain infantrymen from the 3rd Mountain Division, specifically the 139th Mountain Infantry Regiment, reinforced with divisional staff in a town at the end of a fjord 350 kilometers above the Arctic Circle, with no naval support, no reliable resupply route, no reinforcement in prospect, and an Allied force assembling around them that would eventually number many times their own strength. The textbooks of military science have a word for situations like this. It is encirclement. The textbooks generally do not say what to do when the encirclement is that complete and the relief is that distant. What Dietl had, that the textbooks could not fully account for, was the terrain. The mountains around Narvik were not simply obstacles to movement. They were a defensive resource of remarkable quality. Steep, snow-covered, cut through with ravines and ridgelines and positions that a relatively small force of trained mountain troops could hold against a numerically superior enemy for a very long time. The 3rd Mountain Division had trained specifically for this environment. They were not regular infantry who happened to be fighting in the snow. They were specialists, men who understood cold-weather fieldcraft at a level that would take years to replicate in troops who had learned their trade in more forgiving climates. This expertise was not everything, but it was not nothing either. The immediate crisis in the first days after the naval battles was supply. The ships on the fjord bottom had taken down with them a substantial portion of the expedition's equipment, ammunition, and stores. Dietl's men improvised with energy that would later be written about in admiring terms by both sides. The sailors, whose ships had been sunk, men who were now, in a practical sense, stranded ashore with no vessel to serve, were rearmed with whatever weapons could be salvaged and integrated into the infantry defensive line as improvised foot soldiers. They were naval personnel fighting a land battle in the mountains of Norway, and by all accounts they adapted with more competence than might have been expected. Sailors, it turned out, could learn to hold a ridgeline. Equipment was retrieved from the sunken destroyers and from supply caches that had been put ashore before the naval battles. The railway connection east towards Sweden became crucial, not as a resupply route. Sweden was rigidly neutral and would not permit the passage of military equipment, but as a fallback line. If Dietl's position at Narvik itself became militarily untenable, his men could retreat along the railway into the mountains, maintaining a presence in Norwegian territory and denying the Allies a clean occupation. This option was understood by everyone as a last resort, a way of not losing rather than a way of winning. But it was an option, and in the early weeks of the Allied build-up around Narvik, it was the thing that kept the German position from being purely hopeless. The Allied force assembling against Dietel was, at its eventual peak, a collection of impressive military credentials. Norwegian brigades who knew the terrain and had the motivation of fighting for their own country, British infantry and later British mountain and commando units, 2 battalions of the French Foreign Legion soldiers who had fought in some of the most demanding conditions in the world, from the Atlas Mountains to the jungles of Indochina, and who brought a particular kind of hardened professionalism to the Arctic campaign. A Polish independent Highland brigade, numbering close to 5,000 soldiers, who had escaped the fall of their own country in September 1939 and were fighting now with the particular intensity of men who had already lost everything once. This was not a negligible force. And yet, in the weeks of April and into early May, the Allied offensive around Narvik moved with a slowness that frustrated commanders, confused observers, and would later generate considerable historical criticism. The reasons were structural as much as tactical. The Allied command arrangements were complex, with British, French, Norwegian, and Polish units operating under a divided and sometimes unclear chain of authority. Supply to forces operating above the Arctic Circle in April presented challenges that planners in London had not fully anticipated. The geography that favoured Dietel's defenders also made it extremely difficult for the attackers to mass force at decisive points without long, exposed approaches across terrain where a small number of defenders could delay a large number of attackers almost indefinitely. Through late April and into early May, the fighting around Narvik settled into a pattern of probing attacks, contested ridgelines, artillery exchanges, and the particular exhaustion of soldiers living and fighting in deep snow at altitude in temperatures that swung brutally between day and night. The German position was under pressure, but it was holding. Dietel's mountain troops, augmented by the sailor infantrymen and later by a small group of airborne troops who parachuted in from Junkers transport aircraft to bolster the garrison, were demonstrating that the terrain could substitute for the numbers they lacked. Every Allied battalion that was stopped on a ridgeline, every patrol that was turned back from a mountain approach, was additional time that the German garrison was buying for itself. The Luftwaffe contributed to this defence in a way that complicated the Allied operation significantly. German aircraft operating from bases in southern Norway, a long distance away, at the limits of their range for operations over Narvik, struck at Allied shipping in the fjords and at landing sites along the coast. In early May, the Polish destroyer Grom was sunk in a bombing raid, with the loss of 59 of her crew. The air threat forced Allied ships to operate cautiously and limited the rate at which supplies and reinforcements could be landed. Dietel did not control the air over Narvik, but the Luftwaffe's presence complicated the Allied build-up enough to slow the timeline further. Hitler, watching the Narvik situation from his command headquarters, oscillated between ordering Dietel to hold at all costs and contemplating a withdrawal that would save the troops but effectively abandon the campaign. He told his staff at various points that the position was impossible. He gave Dietel enormous latitude, more than was typical for a commander of Dietel's rank at this stage of the war, because he recognized that Dietel was the man on the mountain, that Dietel could see things on that ridgeline that no headquarters could see from a map. This relationship between Hitler and Dietel, formed in the crisis of Narvik, would persist. It would, in time, carry its own complications as such relationships always do. But in April and May of 1940, what it produced was a mountain general who had the freedom to fight his own battle and who used that freedom with considerable skill. The mountain held, and every day it held was a day borrowed against an outcome that was not yet written. Chapter 6. The Allies push forward. By the middle of May 1940, the Allied command had decided that the battle for Narvik could no longer drift at the slow pace of the previous weeks. The forces were assembled, the plans were drawn, and the pressure from London and Paris, increasingly anxious about the broader Norwegian campaign, which was going badly in the south, demanded a visible success at Narvik. If the Allies could recapture the port, It would be something concrete, in a campaign that had produced very little that was concrete. It would demonstrate that Germany could be beaten on the ground, that the first weeks of the war had not established some permanent condition of Allied inferiority. It would, perhaps most importantly, demonstrate to smaller nations watching the conflict that siding with the Allies was not a commitment to shared defeat. The plan that emerged for the main assault centered on a two-pronged approach. An amphibious landing at Björkvik, a small settlement north of Narvik, on Ofotfjord, would be conducted by the French Foreign Legion battalions, supported by naval gunfire and accompanied by the Polish Highland Brigade pushing on the southern flank. The Björkvik operation was scheduled for the 13th of May, 1940, and it represented the largest and most complex Allied military operation mounted anywhere in the Norwegian campaign. The French Foreign Legion troops who made the landing had been briefed thoroughly and had trained for exactly this kind of shore assault. The naval support was substantial. Everything was prepared as carefully as the conditions allowed. The Björkvik landing succeeded. Under fire from shore defences that Dietl's men had constructed during the weeks of build-up, the French Foreign Legion came ashore and pushed inland with the kind of controlled aggression that was characteristic of their training. The Polish brigade attacked in coordination on their assigned axis. The German defence at Björkvik, determined as it was, could not hold against the combined weight of the assault. By the time the fighting at Björkvik was concluded, the Allies had established a firm bridgehead north of Narvik and were positioned to push southward toward the town itself. The momentum that had been missing for weeks had arrived in a single operational bound. For Dietl's garrison, the Björkvik landing was more than a tactical setback. It was a signal that the Allied forces had decided to fight seriously, that the slow approach of the previous weeks had been preparation rather than hesitation. The German position was now being compressed from multiple directions. Norwegian forces held positions to the northeast. British infantry was pressing from positions to the west and southwest. The French and Polish forces were now established north of the town. The railway east towards Sweden was still technically available as a final fallback, but using it would mean abandoning Narvik itself, a decision that had profound implications for the German claim to be holding Norway and for Hitler's stated determination not to yield ground that German forces had taken. The weeks between Björkvik and the final assault on Narvik itself were marked by fighting of considerable intensity in the surrounding mountains. The topography of the Narvik area does not produce clean, linear fronts. It produces isolated engagements on hillsides and ridges, control of individual peaks that provide observation over stretches of valley, the capture and recapture of positions that matter enormously in 3 dimensions and are nearly invisible on a flat map. The Norwegian soldiers fighting in this terrain had advantages beyond their motivation. They knew the mountains in the way that men who grew up in them know terrain. They could navigate in conditions where other soldiers would stop moving. This local knowledge, combined with the strength of the French and Polish contingents in the heavier combat of the lower slopes, created a combination that Dietl's garrison was finding increasingly difficult to answer. Air power remained a contested factor throughout. The Luftwaffe continued to strike at Allied shipping in the fjords and at forward supply positions ashore. British fighters operating from improvised landing strips on the Norwegian coast provided some protection, but air coverage over the Narvik area was never comprehensive enough to give the Allies full freedom of operation in the fjord. The Royal Navy's destroyers and cruisers maintained a presence in the outer waters, providing naval gunfire support to Allied ground operations and intercepting German supply attempts, of which there were very few successful ones. The naval picture around Narvik had been settled decisively by the 2 battles of the fjord. The air picture was more contested, but it leaned toward the Allies in proportion as German aircraft had to fly further from their southern Norwegian bases to reach the battle area. On the 28th of May, 1940, Norwegian and Allied forces retook Narvik. The final assault combined Norwegian troops, French Foreign Legionnaires, and Polish Highland Brigade soldiers in a coordinated operation that pushed through the German defensive line and reached the port. Dietl's garrison withdrew eastward along the railway into the mountains toward the Swedish border, fighting as they retreated, and maintaining their cohesion in a way that prevented the withdrawal from becoming a rout. The town of Narvik, battered, scarred by weeks of artillery, its harbour strewn with the wreckage of ships from both sides' fleets, was in Allied hands for the first time since the 9th of April. It was, as historians would later note, the first Allied land victory of the Second World War, the first time that Allied ground forces had advanced against German-held positions and taken them. The significance of this, after the accumulating reverses of the first 9 months of the war, was real. It proved that German forces could be dislodged from positions they had taken and fortified. It showed that coordinated Allied operations, multinational in composition, complex in execution, could succeed against a determined and skilled enemy. And it gave the soldiers who had fought for weeks in the Arctic mountains a moment that was not borrowed or qualified. They had won. What they did not yet know, what the signals coming from London and Paris were only beginning to make clear, in the way that catastrophic news always arrives slightly behind, the catastrophe itself was that the victory they had fought so hard to achieve was already being reconsidered. Somewhere to the south, in another country, events were moving that would make Narvik irrelevant to the decisions that mattered most. The German offensive in the west had begun on the 10th of May, and by the 28th of May, the day Narvik fell to the Allies, France was in crisis. The mountain had been taken, and now the order was coming to give it back. If you are still with us, and at this point in the story, you know what is coming, then you already understand why this battle matters. Not because of the ships at the bottom of the fjord, though those matter. Not because of the Victoria Cross, though that matters too. But because of the timing. Because the same week that Allied soldiers raised a flag over Narvik, the news from France was already making that flag conditional. The next 6 chapters will take us through the evacuation, through the collapse of the Norwegian campaign, and through the long aftermath, the occupation, the resistance, and the reckoning that came years later for the men and the town that had, briefly, stood at the centre of everything. Subscribe and keep this playing. Chapter 7 begins right now. Chapter 7. The order that undid everything. There is a particular kind of military tragedy that has nothing to do with defeat in the field. It is the tragedy of the order that arrives after the victory, the signal from a distant headquarters that recalculates the meaning of ground that soldiers have just paid for with weeks of their lives. On the 28th of May, 1940, Norwegian and Allied soldiers stood in Narvik and understood, in the most immediate and physical way, that they had won. The harbour was theirs. The German garrison had retreated. The town, damaged, scarred, smelling of cordite and cold water, was in Allied hands for the first time in 7 weeks. And somewhere in that same hour, in London, the decision was already being made that would require them to give it back. The context for that decision was not Narvik, it was France. The German offensive in the west had begun on the 10th of May, 1940, the same day, coincidentally, that Winston Churchill became Prime Minister, replacing Neville Chamberlain in one of the pivotal governmental transitions of the war. Within days, the Wehrmacht's armoured forces had broken through the Allied line in the Ardennes and were driving toward the English Channel, threatening to cut off the entire British expeditionary force and the best of the French armies in Belgium. By the 20th of May, German armour had reached the Channel coast. By the 26th of May, the evacuation from the beaches of Dunkirk had begun. Europe was in a state of strategic crisis that made the iron ore route to Germany a secondary consideration, and Narvik a place that Britain could no longer afford to garrison. The Supreme War Council, the combined Anglo-French body responsible for coordinating Allied strategy, met in the last days of May and made its assessment. The situation in France was deteriorating faster than any optimistic scenario had projected. The forces committed to Norway, particularly the British and French units at Narvik, were needed elsewhere. Not to reinforce France, which was by then beyond the point where additional divisions could change the outcome, but to reconstitute the Allied military capacity for the defence of Britain itself, which was now, suddenly, the primary concern. The order to evacuate the Narvik area, when it came, was not the product of small minds making bad decisions. It was the product of a correct reading of a terrible situation. The problem, the human problem, the problem that sits beneath the strategic problem like the rock beneath the fjord, was what this decision meant for the people it affected most directly. For the Norwegian soldiers who had retaken their own town, the evacuation order was not a military recalculation, it was an abandonment. Norway had committed its remaining organised armed forces to the Narvik campaign on the understanding that the Allies were committed to the Norwegian campaign, that the nation was not fighting alone, that the sacrifice being made in the mountains had a military logic that connected to a larger Allied effort. The evacuation order severed that understanding. It said, in effect, the larger calculation has changed, and the smaller one must yield to it. For the Norwegians who received this news, the smaller calculation was their country. King Haakon VII and his government had been in continuous displacement since the German invasion of the 9th of April, moving from Oslo to Elverum to Tromsø, always one step ahead of the German advance, conducting the war from wherever they could while maintaining the constitutional legitimacy of the Norwegian state. When the Allied decision to evacuate became known to the Norwegian government, communicated with considerable diplomatic delicacy, given what was being communicated, the response was to make the only decision available. If the Allies were withdrawing from Norway, Norway would have to negotiate the continuation of its resistance from outside its own territory. The king and his government would leave for Britain. The fight would go on, but from exile. Norway would not surrender. It would simply have to change where it stood. The logistics of the evacuation, codenamed Operation Alphabet, were themselves a significant undertaking. The Allied force at Narvik and in the surrounding region numbered in the high tens of thousands. British, French, Norwegian, and Polish troops, along with the naval personnel and support staff that any modern military operation accumulates. Getting them all onto ships, in the correct order of priority, using the limited pier facilities at Harstad and the surrounding anchorages, under the constant threat of Luftwaffe air attack, was an exercise in organised urgency. The naval forces protecting the evacuation destroyers, cruisers, and the carriers HMS Glorious and HMS Ark Royal, which provided air cover, were operating at the edge of their endurance in waters that were hostile in both senses of the word. The evacuation was kept secret from the German forces on the ground for as long as possible. Allied units continued to conduct offensive operations in the Narvik area through the first days of June, both to maintain the deception and because some commanders genuinely hoped that orders might change if they kept pressing forward. The Polish Highland Brigade, in particular, advanced along the southern shore of Ofotfjord in early June in what was, without the soldiers knowing it, one of the last Allied offensive operations in Norway. They took ground. They pushed the German rearguard back. And then they received the order that undid the meaning of everything they had just done. The French Foreign Legion battalions that had led the Bjørkvik landing, the men who had come ashore under fire and cleared a path to Narvik, were among the last to embark. Their withdrawal was conducted with the disciplined professionalism of soldiers who had been in impossible situations before in other parts of the world, and who understood that the military virtue required in retreat is exactly the same as the military virtue required in advance: controlled composure in the presence of chaos. They boarded their ships in good order. The ships left the fjord in the early days of June, moving southward toward the open sea, past the ridgelines where they had fought and the harbour they had helped to take, watching the mountains recede. Behind them, Dietl's garrison, which had retreated along the railway toward the Swedish border and was by this point in a condition of profound exhaustion, received word that the Allies were withdrawing. The German mountain troops, who had spent weeks in a state of isolation, under constant pressure, fighting in snow and cold with dwindling ammunition and no certainty that reinforcement would ever come, now learned that they could return to Narvik. They came back into the town through the rubble and the silence and the particular emptiness of a place recently occupied by a force that has just left. There was no triumphant entry. There was too much exhaustion for that. There was simply the return to a place they had been told to hold and had held, and had then been forced out of, and were now returning to a cycle of possession that the town's civilian population had watched from its cellars and hillsides with the specific helplessness of people whose home has become someone else's tactical problem. Norway signed a ceasefire with Germany on the 10th of June, 1940, formally ending organized Norwegian military resistance on Norwegian soil. The last act of the official Norwegian campaign was not a battle but a signature made under duress, acknowledging that the remaining organized forces, those still fighting in the north, could no longer continue. It was a military capitulation, not a political one. The king and government were already in Britain. The Norwegian state was intact. The resistance was not over. But the open, organized, conventional military phase of Norway's war was finished, and Narvik, the town that had been at the center of it all, was once again under German occupation, beginning what would prove to be 5 years of a very different kind of conflict. Chapter 8. What the evacuation cost. In the accounting of wars, evacuations are strange entries. They are not victories, they are not, strictly speaking, defeats, though they often follow defeats or anticipate them. They are the military equivalent of a calculated loss. You accept a certain cost now in order to avoid a larger cost later. The evacuation from northern Norway in early June 1940 falls into this category, but with a particular weight of tragedy added to it, because the losses during the withdrawal itself, after the decision to leave, had already been made, after the strategic calculation had already been completed, were among the highest of the entire campaign. The most devastating single event of the Norwegian evacuation occurred on the 8th of June, 1940, when the aircraft carrier HMS Glorious, escorted by the destroyers HMS Ardent and HMS Acasta, was intercepted by the German battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau in the Norwegian Sea. Glorious had been operating in support of the Norwegian campaign and was carrying Royal Air Force aircraft on her deck, Hurricanes and Gladiators, that had been operating from Norwegian airfields and could not be abandoned. Ashore, the exact circumstances of what followed have been debated by naval historians ever since, but the outcome is not disputed. Scharnhorst and Gneisenau opened fire at extreme range, and Glorious, which had no aircraft in the air to provide warning or defense, was struck by heavy shells before her own aircraft could be launched to respond. She sank within roughly an hour and a half. The two destroyer escorts, Ardent and Acasta, did not run. They turned toward the German battleships and attacked, laying smoke and firing torpedoes in an engagement that was, in terms of the raw disparity of forces involved, as asymmetric as any surface action of the Second World War. Ardent was sunk. Acasta scored a torpedo hit on Scharnhorst before she too was overwhelmed and sent to the bottom. The torpedo hit forced Scharnhorst to break off and withdraw to Trondheim for repairs, a small tactical success extracted from a catastrophe, but the cost was terrible. Of the more than 1,500 men aboard Glorious, Ardent, and Acasta combined, only 45 survived to be rescued from the freezing waters of the Norwegian Sea. The search for survivors was slow and incomplete, hampered by the ongoing evacuation operations and the constant threat of further German naval activity. The loss of Glorious cast a shadow over the entire end of the Norwegian campaign that has never fully lifted. It raised questions some answered, many not, about the decisions that put the carrier in that position without proper air cover or adequate screening forces. It raised questions about why a vessel carrying that many men, in waters where German surface units were known to be operating, was not better protected. Naval historians have spent decades examining the record, and the consensus that has emerged is that a combination of factors, the pressure of the evacuation, the exhaustion of the command, the assumptions made about the enemy's position and intentions, combined to create a vulnerability that the Germans exploited with lethal efficiency. The men who died in those waters were not the victims of any single decision. They were the victims of the cumulative weight of a campaign that had been under pressure from its first day. The Polish soldiers of the Independent Highland Brigade embarked on their transport ships in early June with the particular heaviness of men who had experienced this kind of ending before. They had left Poland in September 1939, after the German and Soviet invasions had extinguished any possibility of continued organized resistance there. They had reformed in France, trained, and come to Norway the first time many of them had fought Germans again since the fall of their own country. They had fought well, they had taken their objectives, and now they were embarking again, for the second time in less than a year, leaving behind ground they had just won. The brigade's commander, Brigadier Zygmunt Bohus Sisko, maintained the composure of a professional soldier throughout. His men followed his example. But the weight of what they were carrying geographically and historically was visible to anyone who looked at their faces on the transport piers. The French Foreign Legion men who had led the Björkvik landing loaded onto their transport vessels and began the passage back to France, which by the time they arrived would no longer be the France they had left. The French armistice with Germany came on the 22nd of June, 1940 weeks after the evacuation from Norway had been completed. The soldiers who had fought at Narvik under the French flag would face, on their return, a country in the process of deciding what it meant to continue or to yield, and many of them would make their choices individually in the months that followed, some going to Britain to continue under de Gaulle, others returning to whatever the occupation made possible. The Legion's men from the Norwegian campaign were scattered by the same collapse that had made the evacuation necessary. For the Royal Navy, the Norwegian campaign ended with a balance sheet that was, in its naval component, less negative than the land campaign's conclusion might suggest. The losses were real HMS Hardy, HMS Hunter, HMS Ardent, HMS Acasta, HMS Glorious, and a number of smaller vessels, along with the damage to many more, but the damage inflicted on the Kriegsmarine had been far greater in proportion. 10 German destroyers gone in 4 days at Narvik. The heavy cruiser Blücher sunk at Oslo by Norwegian shore batteries and torpedoes. The cruiser Königsberg sunk at Bergen by British aircraft, one of the first warships ever sunk by aerial bombing in wartime. The cruiser Lutzow damaged. The pocket battleship Scheer damaged. By the end of the Norwegian campaign, the German Navy had lost a significant fraction of its effective surface strength, and what remained was in various states of damage and repair. The significance of these losses compounded through the summer of 1940 in ways that became most visible when Germany began planning Operation Sea Lion, the proposed invasion of Britain. Raeder presented Hitler with an honest assessment of what a cross-channel invasion would require in terms of naval protection and what the German Navy could actually provide. The numbers did not add up. The destroyers lost at Narvik, the cruisers lost at Oslo and Bergen, the repairs required for the ships damaged in Norway, all of this meant that the fleet available for Sea Lion was a fraction of what would have been available if the Norwegian campaign had been executed at lower cost. Raeder told Hitler, in the most direct terms a naval commander could use, that the Navy could not guarantee the safety of an invasion force against the Royal Navy. Sea Lion was postponed indefinitely. The 10 destroyers at the bottom of Ofotfjord had reached forward in time and closed a door. The Norwegian campaign as a whole, including Narvik and everything surrounding it, was also, in a different sense, the making of Winston Churchill's political position. He had been the most visible advocate of aggressive action against Germany's Norwegian supply routes. The mining operation that he had championed had been, in its immediate execution, overtaken by the German invasion. In a narrow sense, the Norwegian campaign could be read as a British failure. But in the parliamentary debate that followed the Norway debate in the House of Commons at the beginning of May, the criticism fell not on Churchill but on Chamberlain. Churchill, who had been as responsible as anyone for the confused British response to the German invasion, emerged from the debate as the man of action, the voice of resistance, the figure around whom opposition to the existing government crystallized. On the 10th of May, when Germany attacked France and the Low Countries, Chamberlain resigned and Churchill became Prime Minister. The Norway campaign had, in a paradox that only politics can fully produce, made the man most associated with the operation's partial failure into the leader of the nation. This, too, was part of Narvik's legacy. What was left, in the summer of 1940, was a town under occupation, a fjord full of wrecks, a garrison of German mountain troops who had survived something that was not supposed to be survivable, and the beginnings of a Norwegian resistance that would operate not from the mountains but from the shadows, a different kind of war, requiring different kinds of courage, lasting not weeks but years. Chapter 9. 5 Years in the Dark. The town that the German occupation force settled into in June 1940 was not the same town that had existed before the 9th of April. In 7 weeks of campaign, Narvik had been shelled, bombed, fought through house by house in its harbour district, and left with the physical evidence of everything that had happened. Buildings were damaged or destroyed, the ore loading facilities had been put out of action. Streets that had been ordinary residential and commercial streets were now marked by shell craters and the evidence of fighting that had passed through them. The civilian population who had endured all of this in cellars and makeshift shelters, in a state of constant uncertainty about what each new day would bring, now emerged into an occupation that would define the next 5 years of their lives, their town, and their understanding of who they were. The German occupation of Norway was administered through a complex structure that evolved over time. At its head, for the first years, was Josef Terboven, appointed Reichskommissar for Norway by Hitler in April 1940. Terboven was a political appointee, a veteran of the Nazi party apparatus rather than a military officer, and his approach to occupation governance prioritized ideological compliance and resource extraction over any genuine engagement with Norwegian society. He worked alongside, and frequently in tension with, the Norwegian fascist leader Vidkun Quisling, whose National Samling Party was the only Norwegian political organization permitted to operate under the occupation. Quisling's name would become, in the years and decades after the war, a common noun in English, a synonym for a collaborator who betrays his country to a foreign occupier. In 1940, he was the nominal Norwegian face of a German-controlled administration. At Narvik specifically, the occupation had a particular military quality because of the town's strategic function. The ore railway, the Ofotfjord railway, connecting Narvik to the Swedish mines at Kiruna, was the entire reason the Germans had come here, and keeping it operational was the first priority of the occupation administration. German engineers worked through the summer and autumn of 1940 to repair the damage to the loading facilities and restore the ore shipments. Swedish ore began moving through Narvik again before the end of 1940, a development that British planners noted with considerable frustration, since it meant that the strategic purpose of the whole campaign interrupting German ore supplies had ultimately not been achieved. The ore kept moving, the ships kept coming. The industry that had made Narvik important continued to make it important, now under a different flag. The Norwegian civilian experience under occupation was shaped by forces that varied by location, by the conduct of individual German commanders, by the degree to which local people engaged with or resisted the occupying authority, and by the changes in German policy that occurred as the war developed. In the early period, the occupation in many Norwegian communities had a surface appearance of relative normality. German soldiers were present, German regulations applied, but daily life continued in recognizable forms. This surface normality was deceptive. Underneath it, the occupation imposed a comprehensive reorganization of Norwegian civic life. Political parties were dissolved, trade unions were taken over, schools were subjected to new curricula, and the press was brought under German control. The space in which Norwegians could think and speak freely contracted steadily. Resistance began almost immediately, and it took forms appropriate to the circumstances. In the early months of the occupation, resistance was primarily passive, refusals to cooperate with new regulations, subtle non-compliance with German directives, the maintenance of solidarity networks among communities that were being pressured to accept the occupation as permanent. Norwegian teachers, in what became one of the most remarkable collective acts of civil resistance of the entire war, refused as a professional body to teach the new Nazi-aligned curriculum that the occupation authorities attempted to introduce in 1941 and 1942. More than 10,000 Norwegian teachers signed a declaration of non-compliance, knowing that there would be consequences. There were. Hundreds of teachers were arrested and sent to forced labor camps in northern Norway. Most were eventually released, and the curriculum change was quietly dropped. The teachers had won. Active resistance sabotage, intelligence collection, escape networks, clandestine radio contact with the Norwegian government in exile in London developed more slowly, as any underground movement must, because it required the building of trust networks in an environment where betrayal could mean death. The Norwegian resistance movement, which became known collectively as Hjemmefronten, the Home Front, organized itself across the 5 years of occupation with increasing sophistication. It fed intelligence to the British. It helped Allied airmen and others who needed to escape find routes out through Sweden. It conducted sabotage operations against German military infrastructure. And it maintained, in the most fundamental sense, the continuity of Norwegian national identity against the occupation's systematic effort to reshape it. Narvik's strategic location meant that it was, throughout the occupation, a place of significant German military presence. The garrison was substantial. The harbour facilities and the railway were under constant guard. For the civilian population, life in a town with this kind of military saturation was oppressive in ways that went beyond specific regulations. The presence of armed foreign soldiers on every street corner, the systematic monitoring of movement and communication, the knowledge that any act of open resistance would bring consequences, not just to the individual, but potentially to family members and neighbours. All of this created a weight of daily life that those who did not live through it find difficult to fully imagine. People adapted, as people do. They found small dignities and small freedoms within a large constraint. They told each other the truth about what they knew in the spaces where Germans could not hear. They waited. The war beyond Norway's borders reached into Narvik's experience in ways that were sometimes direct and sometimes indirect. The convoys to the Soviet Union, the famous Arctic convoys that ran from British ports to Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, from late 1941 onward passed through seas that were, for most of their route, within range of German forces operating from Norwegian bases, aircraft from Norwegian airfields, and surface ships sheltering in Norwegian fjords, including the great battleship Tirpitz, which spent much of the war at anchorages in the Altenfjord and Kofjord in northern Norway, posed constant threats to the convoys that were supplying the Soviet Union's war effort. In this way, Norway's occupation was not a sideshow of the war, but a theatre from which German forces contributed to the largest logistical struggle of the entire conflict. The Norwegian government in exile in London maintained the continuity of the Norwegian state throughout the occupation with a combination of diplomatic skill and sheer determination. King Haakon's broadcasts on BBC radio to occupied Norway were listened to in secret, on hidden radios, by Norwegians who risked punishment if discovered. The king's voice, speaking the Norwegian language, was a reminder that the government existed, that the state had not surrendered its identity, that the occupation was a temporary military fact and not a permanent political reality. These broadcasts were not military operations. They were not sabotage or intelligence collection. They were something else, the maintenance of national morale, of the collective belief that occupation ends and that what a people are does not depend on who currently controls their territory. In the long, dark years of the occupation, that belief required constant renewal. By the middle years of the war, the nature of the occupation was hardening. The early period of relative surface normality gave way, particularly after 1942, to more severe measures as the German administration responded to the growth of organized resistance and to the general tightening of German occupation policy across Europe. The treatment of Norway's Jewish population, a community of roughly 2,000 people, became a catastrophic chapter of the occupation in the autumn of 1942, when Norwegian police, acting under German direction, assisted in the rounding up and deportation of Jewish men, women, and children to camps in the east. The complicity of Norwegian state institutions in this deportation would remain one of the most painful questions in Norwegian collective memory for decades after the war's end. The occupation had not only imposed external oppression, it had, in moments like this one, compelled some Norwegians to participate in that oppression. The accounting for what happened in those years did not end in 1945. Chapter 10: The Home Front and the Long Resistance. A resistance movement is not born fully formed. It develops the way that any complex human organization develops, slowly, unevenly, through trial and error, through the identification of people who can be trusted and the painful discovery of people who cannot. The Norwegian resistance that took shape during the 5 years of German occupation was, by the standards of occupied Europe, one of the most effective and broadly supported national resistance movements of the entire war. This was not an accident of national character, though Norwegian historians have sometimes been tempted to describe it that way. It was the product of specific circumstances, a relatively small and homogeneous population with high levels of social trust, a tradition of individual self-reliance developed over centuries of farming and fishing in demanding geography, a government in exile that maintained continuous contact and direction, and a British intelligence and special operations structure that provided training, resources, and communication links to Norwegians willing to take extraordinary risks. The organization that became the primary vehicle for organized resistance activity was the Milorg, the abbreviation of Militär Organisation, military organization, which was established during 1940 and grew steadily through the occupation years into a clandestine military force that at its peak numbered in the tens of thousands of members across Norway. Milorg was not primarily a sabotage organization, though it conducted sabotage operations. It was conceived and developed as a resistance force that would be prepared, when the moment came, to support an Allied liberation of Norway through armed action. Its members trained in secret, maintained weapons caches, many of them supplied by British aircraft, making clandestine drops in the Norwegian mountains, and waited for the order that would tell them the liberation was beginning. Alongside Milorg, the civilian resistance, the Home Front, in its broader sense, conducted the daily work of non-cooperation, information dissemination, and moral maintenance that kept Norwegian society from being fully absorbed into the occupation's framework. The underground press was one of the most important tools of the civilian resistance. Illegal newspapers and pamphlets printed in secret, distributed through networks of trusted individuals, read and passed on again, carried the truth of the war to communities that the occupation press was serving with German-approved content. The content of these illegal publications ranged from military intelligence and political analysis to simple reassurance that resistance was happening, that Norwegians were not alone, that the war was not going as well for Germany as the official bulletins suggested. The British Special Operations Executive, the SOE, established in July 1940 with Churchill's instruction to set Europe ablaze, engaged with the Norwegian resistance through a dedicated Norwegian section that became one of the SOE's most productive country operations. Norwegian agents were trained at camps in Britain and Scotland, then inserted into Norway by sea, by parachute, or through the Shetland bus, the remarkable clandestine maritime operation that ran fishing boats between the Shetland Islands and the Norwegian coast throughout the occupation years, carrying agents, weapons and supplies to the resistance and bringing refugees and escaped prisoners out in the other direction. The men who crewed the Shetland bus made hundreds of crossings in waters that were routinely dangerous, even without the addition of German air and sea patrols. A significant number of them did not survive. The most celebrated single operation of the Norwegian resistance, one that has entered the wider history of the Second World War, as a defining example of what a small group of trained individuals can achieve against a vastly superior occupying force, was the series of operations against the heavy water plant at Vemork in the Telemark region of southern Norway. Heavy water deuterium oxide was required for certain paths toward a nuclear reactor, which German physicists were pursuing as part of Germany's atomic research program. The plant at Vemork was the only facility in the world capable of producing heavy water in the quantities that this research required. Destroying or disabling it would set back German atomic research significantly. The operations that achieved this destruction, conducted by Norwegian agents and commandos over 2 years between 1942 and 1944, represented some of the most technically demanding, personally courageous special operations of the entire war. The resistance was not without its failures and its tragedies. German counterintelligence, the Sicherheitsdienst and the Gestapo, working alongside the Norwegian collaborationist police, worked continuously to penetrate resistance networks, identify members, and roll up cells before they could conduct their operations. The methods employed in this counterintelligence work were brutal by any standard. Resistance members who were captured faced interrogation techniques designed to extract information about networks and contacts, and the information extracted in this way, sometimes given under duress that most people cannot fully imagine, sometimes led to further arrests, further destruction of networks that had taken months or years to build. The cost of resistance measured in the lives of the people who chose it was real and significant and should not be romanticized away. The relationship between the resistance and the broader Norwegian civilian population was complex in ways that the post-war mythology sometimes simplified. The majority of Norwegians were neither active resistors nor active collaborators. They were people trying to survive an occupation, navigating a situation in which the wrong choice could destroy not just themselves but their families, making the calculations that ordinary people under extraordinary pressure make. How much risk is acceptable? When does survival become collaboration? What does it mean to maintain dignity inside a system designed to strip it away? The active resistors understood this. Most of them came from within the same society, understood the same pressures, and the underground press and the Milorg leadership were careful not to demand more of ordinary people than could reasonably be demanded. They asked for silence, for small acts of solidarity, for the kind of passive non-cooperation that kept the occupation from achieving its full ideological objectives. They reserved the call to active risk for those who had, through their own assessment of the situation, decided they were willing to accept it. In the north of Norway, in the region where Narvik sat, and in the vast territories stretching further toward the Soviet and Finnish borders, the occupation had specific features that distinguished it from the experience of the more densely populated south. The German military presence in the north was enormous, because northern Norway was the base from which German forces conducted operations against the Arctic convoys and threatened the Soviet northern ports. At the peak of the occupation, the German garrison in Norway numbered over 300,000 men, with a substantial concentration in the north. For a country whose total population was roughly 3 million, this was an occupying presence of extraordinary density. The civilian population in the north lived in an environment dominated by military infrastructure, airfields, naval bases, coastal fortifications, railway facilities, in a way that made the occupation feel physically total. The Norwegian merchant marine, the fourth largest in the world at the time of the invasion, became one of Norway's most significant contributions to the Allied war effort during the occupation years. Most of the fleet was outside Norwegian waters when the invasion occurred, and the Norwegian government in exile directed that the ships continue to sail in Allied service rather than return to occupied ports. Norwegian merchant sailors spent the war years carrying supplies across the Atlantic, through the Arctic, through the Mediterranean, in waters where German submarines and aircraft made every voyage a gamble. Close to 4,000 Norwegian merchant sailors lost their lives during these years, a toll that represented a significant fraction of the men who served, and that is remembered in Norway with a particular solemnity, because these men chose their danger freely and paid for that choice repeatedly. The occupation lasted 5 years. It ended not with a dramatic liberation assault, but with Germany's unconditional surrender in May 1945, which was received in Norway with an outpouring of relief and joy that, by all contemporary accounts, was as complete and unrestrained as any such moment in the country's history. King Haakon returned from exile on the 7th of June, 1945, exactly 5 years, almost to the day, after he had left. The date was not coincidental. It was chosen to mark the continuity of the Norwegian state, to say that what had been interrupted in June 1940 had now resumed, that the 5 years were a parenthesis in a history that continued. The resistance had held. Chapter 11. The Kriegsmarine's long accounting. To understand the full weight of what happened in Ofotfjord in April 1940, you need to sit with the numbers for a moment and let them accumulate. Not rush past them in the way that historical narratives sometimes hurry through statistics to reach the next dramatic event, but actually hold them and consider what they represent. In the 4 days between the 9th and 13th of April, 1940, Germany lost 10 destroyers in a single Norwegian fjord. 10. In the context of the Kriegsmarine's total surface strength at the start of the war, this was not a peripheral loss. It was a wound to the Navy's operational capacity that would not heal for years and in some respects never healed at all, because the conditions that might have allowed the rebuilding of the destroyer fleet were precisely the conditions that the war made impossible. At the start of the Second World War, Germany had roughly 22 destroyers in operational service. This was already a small force compared to what a navy aspiring to global naval power would have wanted, reflecting the constraints that the Versailles Treaty had placed on German rearmament in the 1920s and the relatively late start of serious naval construction under the Nazi regime's naval building programs of the mid-1930s. The ships that existed were capable and well-armed. The German destroyer designs of the period were, in some respects, technically advanced compared to their British counterparts, but there were never enough of them to provide the kind of fleet destroyer strength that the Navy's strategic ambitions required. Raeder knew this. He had argued for larger building programs repeatedly before the war. He had been told, repeatedly, that the industrial capacity was allocated elsewhere. Losing 10 of roughly 22, very nearly half the total in 4 days of fighting in a Norwegian fjord, was therefore not a manageable attrition. It was a strategic disruption. The Kriegsmarine's ability to perform destroyer missions, fleet screening, torpedo attacks, mine-laying, convoy escort, coastal patrol was halved in 96 hours. Replacements could be built, and were built, but naval construction takes years, not weeks. The destroyers that Germany laid down in response to the Narvik losses would not reach operational service until the war was well advanced, by which point the strategic situation had changed in ways that made their arrival less decisive than their absence had been. The gap existed at the precise moment when it mattered most. The most immediate operational consequence was the paralysis of Sea Lion planning during the summer of 1940. Raeder's presentation to Hitler on the feasibility of the proposed British invasion laid out, with professional honesty, what the Navy could and could not guarantee. It could not guarantee protection against the Royal Navy. It did not have enough surface ships to adequately screen a convoy of invasion barges across the English Channel against a British fleet that, though it had also taken losses in Norway and at Dunkirk, remained substantially intact and aggressively handled. The losses at Narvik were explicitly part of Raeder's calculation. He did not present Sea Lion as impossible, he presented it as a gamble that the Navy was not in a position to manage. Hitler, who had the army general's instinct that the English Channel was an obstacle too large to take by storm without naval dominance, agreed. Sea Lion was effectively shelved by mid-September 1940. The consequences for the Atlantic campaign were less immediately dramatic, but equally significant over time. German submarine warfare in the Atlantic depended, for its logistical chain, on a surface fleet capable of certain supporting functions providing weather information, occasionally operating as a diversion to draw off convoy escort forces, and in theory supporting major surface operations that might force the Royal Navy to divert resources from convoy escort. The loss of destroyer strength reduced the flexibility of this support role. More critically, the loss of surface units in Norway, not just destroyers, but the damage to heavier ships, meant that the Atlantic surface raiding operations that Germany had planned as a major component of its war against British supply lines were conducted with smaller forces than intended and at greater risk than the naval staff had calculated acceptable. The heavy units that had been designed to work in combination with destroyer screens found themselves operating without adequate light force support. The battleships, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, conducted their Atlantic raiding operation in the winter of 1940-41, Operation Berlin, and had a degree of success in terms of merchant tonnage threatened. But they were operating at the limits of acceptable risk without the destroyer screen that doctrine called for. When Bismarck's sortie in May 1941 ended in disaster, the mighty battleships sunk by a combination of fleet air-arm torpedo attack and Royal Navy gunfire, the post-action analysis identified, among multiple contributing factors, the inadequacy of the escort forces available for what had been planned as a larger operation. The shadows of Narvik fell across the Atlantic, quietly shaping the possibilities available to a navy that could not replace what it had lost. The German surface fleet's decline into strategic passivity through the middle years of the war was not caused solely by Narvik, the sinking of Bismarck. The damage to Scharnhorst by HMS Duke of York in December 1943, the gradual accumulation of losses across multiple theatres all contributed. But Narvik was the first and in many ways the most concentrated single episode of surface fleet destruction, and it set a tone. After April 1940, the Kriegsmarine surface forces were always playing catch-up with their own losses, never quite managing to rebuild the strength that had existed at the war's beginning, never able to recover the destroyer depth that would have given the heavier ships the operational flexibility their designers had intended. There is a specific irony embedded in this story that is worth pausing on. The German invasion of Norway was designed, in significant part, to secure the iron ore supply route, the supply route that ran through Narvik, down the Norwegian coast, and into German industrial ports. The invasion achieved this objective. The ore continued to flow. German steel production was not interrupted. But the cost of achieving this objective, the 10 destroyers, the heavy cruiser Blücher, the damage to multiple heavier units, the losses in subsequent operations from Norwegian bases, was a naval price that exceeded, in strategic terms, the value of what was secured. The ore kept Germany's factories running, but the navy that had been broken to secure the ore route could no longer adequately protect the sea lanes on which Germany's broader strategic ambitions depended. It was a trade whose full cost was paid over years in waters far from Norway. Raeder himself understood this, with a clarity that his position prevented him from fully expressing. He had pushed for the Norwegian operation because he saw it as necessary. He had watched it unfold and had seen the naval losses mount to a level he had not fully anticipated, or perhaps had anticipated but had not been able to stop. His relationship with Hitler, always complicated by Hitler's fundamental preference for land power and his tendency to override naval professional advice with intuitive strategic judgments, deteriorated through the war years, as the surface fleet's declining effectiveness made the conversations between them increasingly frustrating on both sides. He resigned as Commander-in-Chief of the Navy in January 1943, replaced by Karl Dönitz, the submarine commander who had never shared Raeder's belief in the relevance of surface naval power. The navy that built the destroyers that fought at Narvik ended the war as a submarine force, its surface element reduced to a footnote. The wrecks of those 10 destroyers are still at the bottom of Ofotfjord today. In the decades since the war, diving expeditions have documented what remains: the corroded hulls, the gun turrets, the propeller shafts, the pieces of machinery that once made these ships among the most powerful destroyer-class vessels afloat. For divers who make the descent into those cold, dark waters, the wrecks are extraordinary encounters with preserved history. For naval historians, they are the most visible evidence of a calculation that went wrong, a naval commitment in service of a strategic objective that achieved its objective and destroyed its instruments simultaneously. The bottom of the fjord, in this reading, is not just a graveyard, it is a ledger. Chapter 12, The Arctic Convoys and Narvik's Long Shadow. There is a dimension of the Narvik story that most accounts stop short of fully exploring, because it requires following the thread not just through the battle and its immediate aftermath, but forward in time, into the middle years of the war, when the consequences of what had happened in the fjord in April 1940 expressed themselves in a different theatre, against a different enemy, in a different strategic context. That thread leads to the Arctic convoys, the supply lifeline that Britain and later the United States ran from ports in Scotland and Iceland to the Soviet northern ports of Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, beginning in the late summer of 1941, after Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union brought that country into the Allied coalition. The convoys ran through some of the most dangerous waters in the world, and Norway, specifically German-occupied Norway, with its fjords, its airfields, its naval bases, and its single remaining major warship was central to why those waters were so dangerous. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June, 1941, the strategic situation changed in ways that reoriented every calculation about what mattered and where. Britain, which had been fighting alone since the fall of France a year earlier, suddenly had an ally of enormous size and population on the Eastern Front, an ally that was, in the first weeks and months, absorbing catastrophic losses and screaming for material support. Churchill's response was immediate and characteristically decisive. Britain would send whatever it could. The problem was that the routes for sending it were limited. The Atlantic route to Soviet Pacific ports was impossibly long. The route through Iran was being developed but was slow to establish. The most direct route, the one that could deliver supplies most quickly, was across the northern seas, past occupied Norway, through the gap between the ice cap and the North Cape, and into the Soviet northern ports. This route put every convoy within striking range of German forces based in Norway for a substantial portion of its length. Aircraft from Norwegian airfields, Junkers, 88 bombers, and torpedo aircraft. Focke-Wulf Condor, maritime patrol aircraft. Heinkel torpedo aircraft could reach convoys in the Norwegian Sea and the Barents Sea. German submarines, operating from Norwegian bases including those at Narvik's neighbouring fjord systems, could intercept convoys along the route. And then there was the particular threat that made convoy planning in 1942 a matter of constant nightmare for the Admiralty. The Tirpitz, Germany's largest and most powerful battleship, which had been moved to Norwegian waters in January 1942 and anchored in the Trondheim Fjord, later moving further north to Altenfjord. Tirpitz never fired her main guns at a convoy. She did not need to. Her mere presence in Norwegian waters, the possibility that she might sortie against a convoy, was enough to reshape the entire Allied convoy strategy. A convoy escorted by destroyers and cruisers would be annihilated if Tirpitz appeared in the convoy lanes. The only countermeasure was to keep capital ships, battleships, and carriers with the convoys as a deterrent force. But keeping capital ships in Arctic convoy duties meant that those ships were not available for other operations. The threat of a single German battleship in a Norwegian fjord tied down multiple British capital ships and consumed enormous resources in intelligence monitoring, air reconnaissance, and planning for operations to destroy or neutralize her. The disaster of convoy PQ-17 in July 1942 was the most dramatic demonstration of how the German presence in Norway could reach across the water and destroy a convoy without ever leaving port. When intelligence suggested that the Tirpitz had sortied from Altenfjord, the First Sea Lord ordered the convoy to scatter to disperse and have individual merchant ships make for Soviet ports independently, reasoning that a dispersed convoy offered less concentrated target than a formed convoy if Tirpitz reached the convoy lanes. The order to scatter was given. The convoy dispersed. Tirpitz had not in fact sortied. She turned back before reaching the convoy lanes, but the scattered merchant ships, now without naval escort and spread across the Barents Sea, were found by German submarines and aircraft operating from Norwegian bases. 24 of the 35 merchant ships in the convoy were sunk. Roughly 100,000 tons of military supplies, tanks, aircraft, ammunition went to the bottom of the Barents Sea. It was one of the worst convoy disasters of the entire war. The connection to Narvik in all of this is not simply geographic, though geography is part of it. Narvik as a port, as a fjord system, as a naval base, was one element in the much larger system of German military infrastructure that Norway had become under occupation. But the strategic logic that had made Narvik important in 1940, the iron ore route, the value of the ice-free port, was the same logic that made Norway important to the Arctic convoy threat. The Germans had come to Norway to secure a resource supply route. They stayed in Norway because Norway was a base from which the entire Northern Sea approaches could be dominated. The invasion of 1940 and the occupation that followed had handed Germany a 4,000-kilometre coastline of strategic real estate that continued to generate military value throughout the war. The Royal Navy's efforts to neutralise Tirpitz are themselves a long story within the larger story of the war's northern theatre. Multiple operations were mounted against her: carrier-based air attacks, midget submarine attacks, more carrier strikes, and eventually, in November 1944, A series of attacks by Royal Air Force Lancaster bombers carrying purpose-built 12,000-pound tallboy bombs, which finally capsized the battleship in her anchorage at Tromsø. The midget submarine attack in September 1943, Operation Source, in which 6 X-craft submarines penetrated the Ofotfjord anchorage and placed charges under Tirpitz's keel, caused sufficient damage to put her out of action for months, and the men who conducted it were awarded Victoria Crosses in recognition of what they had done. The tradition of extraordinary individual courage in the northern Norwegian theatres, which had begun with Warburton Lee in the darkness of Ofotfjord, continued to manifest in the years that followed. The sailors who made the Arctic convoy runs through the years of the war experienced a particular kind of hardship that distinguished their service even in a war that was generally not short of hardship. The cold at those latitudes, combined with the scale of the seas and the constancy of the operational threat, produced conditions that tested human endurance beyond what most military service requires. Men who fell into the water from ships sunk by submarine, aircraft, or surface vessel survived for minutes, not hours, before hypothermia overwhelmed them. The rescue procedures of the period could not always be executed quickly enough in combat conditions to save men who had gone into the water. Thousands of merchant and naval sailors died in those Arctic waters at every stage of the convoy routes across the years of the campaign. The Arctic convoys remain, among all the forgotten corners of the Second World War's naval history, among the most physically demanding and costly of all the campaigns. For Norway, the Arctic convoys had a specific significance beyond the purely strategic. The supply that flowed through those routes was going to the Soviet Union, which was fighting Germany on a front that ultimately ground down the German military to the point of defeat. Norway's geography made it the base from which Germany threatened those supplies. Norway's occupation made it possible for Germany to use that geography for years. And at the end of the war, it would be Soviet forces moving from the east, through Finland, into Norwegian territory, who would liberate the northernmost part of Norway, the Finnmark region, in the autumn and winter of 1944-45, before the German surrender made the liberation of the rest of the country possible. The Arctic War had come full circle, ending in the same northern Norwegian landscape where it had begun. The wrecks in Ofotfjord do not know any of this. They sit in the cold, dark water, their steel slowly corroding through the decades, their presence marking a moment in time that had consequences stretching far beyond the fjord itself. Sailors from multiple nations, British, German, Norwegian, passed through those waters in 1940 and left things behind: ships, lives, the physical remnants of a battle fought for iron ore and strategic position at the top of the world. The consequences of that battle, the broken destroyer fleet, the constrained sea lion, the compounded difficulties of the Atlantic campaign, the threat from Norwegian bases to Arctic convoys were not visible in the fjord itself. They were distributed across the years of the war in decisions made in planning rooms and operations centres that had never heard of Narvik but were operating in a world shaped by what had happened there. We are now 2/3 of the way through the complete history of the Battle of Narvik. You have travelled from the ore docks and the planning maps, through the smoke of the fjord battles, through the mountains and the occupation, through the long resistance and the strategic consequences that Narvik sent rippling forward across years of war. The final 6 chapters covering the liberation of Norway, the return of the king, the post-war reckoning, the memory and the museums, the meaning of what Narvik holds for the 21st century, and the final legacy of all the men who fought in those waters will complete the story. If this documentary has been part of your night, we are glad it was here. Subscribe and let Chapter 13 begin. Chapter 13, The Hero of Narvik and His Complicated Legacy. There are men whom war makes into symbols before they have finished being men. Edward Dietel was one of them. By the time the German garrison returned to Narvik in June 1940, after the Allied evacuation had emptied the mountains and the town had passed back under German control, Dietel's story had already been taken from him and transformed into something the regime in Berlin could use. He had held Narvik against overwhelming odds that much was true. He had kept 2,000 mountain troops coherent and fighting across weeks of isolation, with no naval lifeline, with ammunition running low, with an enemy force that outnumbered him many times over, in terrain that punished every mistake and forgave almost none. The tactical achievement was real. But the meaning that was placed on top of that achievement, the propaganda architecture that Berlin built around it, was something different from the reality entirely, and Dietl would spend the remaining years of his life inside that construction, unable to step outside it even if he had wanted to. Hitler personally awarded Dietl the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross in June 1940, making him one of the first recipients of what would become the war's most recognizable military decoration. The ceremony was conducted with the full ceremonial weight that the regime brought to these occasions, and the photographs of Hitler presenting the decoration to the lean, weathered mountain general circulated widely in German newspapers and newsreels. The propaganda apparatus seized on the Narvik story with particular enthusiasm because it had the narrative elements that the regime most valued: a small German force, isolated and outnumbered, holding out against the combined might of multiple Allied nations, sustained by will and skill and the particular toughness of German mountain soldiers. The story of Narvik, in its official German version, became a parable of National Socialist resilience of German soldiers who could not be beaten if they refused to yield. The reality of what Dietl's men had endured was somewhat more complicated than this parable allowed. The German garrison had not simply held by virtue of superior morale or ideological commitment. They had held because the terrain was enormously favourable to a determined defender, because the Allied command had been slow and divided in its offensive operations, because the French and Polish forces that eventually threatened the position seriously only arrived at Narvik late in the campaign, and because the Allied decision to evacuate driven by the crisis in France had saved the garrison from a position that was genuinely becoming untenable. In the final week before the Allied evacuation, Dietl's men had been pushed back to the railway line, their position in Narvik town itself lost, their options reduced to continued retreat or surrender. The evacuation, not German will alone, was what preserved them. The propaganda version erased this context. Dietl himself was a professional soldier of genuine ability, and his personal courage in the Narvik campaign was never in question. His management of the garrison, the integration of the stranded sailors into the defensive line, the maintenance of unit cohesion under prolonged pressure, the tactical judgment that allowed a small force to exploit difficult terrain, effectively demonstrated qualities of military leadership that would have earned respect in any army. He was also, and this matters, a committed member of the National Socialist movement, one of the few senior Wehrmacht commanders who was ideologically aligned with the regime rather than merely professionally loyal to it. He had known Hitler personally since the early 1920s, when Hitler was still a minor political figure in Munich and Dietl was a young army officer drawn into the circle around him. This personal connection to Hitler was part of what had given Dietl the exceptional operational latitude he had enjoyed during the Narvik campaign, the freedom to make his own decisions without the micromanagement that Hitler typically imposed on commanders he did not personally trust. After Narvik, Dietl commanded German mountain forces in the continuing Finnish-German campaign in the far north. The operations aimed at cutting the Murmansk railway and denying the Soviet Union its Arctic supply port. This campaign, which lasted from June 1941 until the German withdrawal from Finland in 1944, was one of the most static and least discussed major campaigns of the entire war, a grinding struggle in subarctic terrain that made minimal territorial progress at enormous human cost on both sides. Dietl managed this campaign as he had managed Narvik, professionally, with skill in the use of terrain, and with a consistent attention to the welfare of his men that his troops genuinely valued. His personal qualities as a field commander were not diminished by the cause in whose service they were deployed. This is one of the uncomfortable truths of military history. Skill and commitment to a monstrous ideology are not mutually exclusive, and the presence of one does not redeem or cancel the other. The manner of Dietl's death in June 1944 was, and remains, somewhat mysterious. He died in an aircraft crash in the Austrian Alps, returning from a meeting with Hitler. Several other senior officers who had been at the same meeting died in the same crash or in crashes around the same time, and the circumstances have generated speculative theories, none of them conclusively proven, about whether the crashes were accidents or something else. The official German account was that the aircraft encountered bad weather and came down in the mountains. This explanation was accepted at the time, and there is no firm evidence against it. What is true is that Dietl had, in the weeks before his death, expressed private reservations about the direction of the war and about certain German military policies that he found professionally and personally troubling. Whether those reservations had any connection to his death is one of the questions that the historical record cannot answer with certainty, and smart narrative reconstruction requires acknowledging the uncertainty rather than filling it with speculation. Hitler's reaction to Dietl's death was, by contemporary accounts, one of genuine grief, the kind of response that comes from the loss of someone considered a personal friend rather than merely a useful commander. He ordered a state funeral, with honours appropriate to the man he had publicly celebrated as the hero of Narvik. The funeral was attended by the senior figures of the Nazi regime, and Dietl was buried with the decorations he had accumulated in 4 years of distinguished service in causes that history has judged with appropriate harshness. His reputation in Germany went through the patterns that characterize many military figures of the period, celebrated during the war, subjected to reassessment afterward. His genuine professional qualities acknowledged alongside the ideological commitments that gave those qualities their most consequential expression. He was not a war criminal in the specific legal sense that the post-war tribunals defined. There is no credible evidence of personal involvement in atrocities of the kind that other German commanders ordered or permitted in their areas of command, but he was a convinced supporter of the system that produced those atrocities, and his service sustained that system through its most consequential years. The hero of Narvik was also, simply, a man who believed in what he was fighting for, and what he was fighting for was one of the worst things the 20th century produced. The post-war treatment of Dietl in Germany reflected the broader difficulty that German society had through the decades following the war, with military figures who were professionally admirable and ideologically compromised simultaneously. In Bavaria, where he had been born and where he retained a certain regional identity, he was commemorated in ways that later generations found increasingly problematic. Streets and barracks named after him, plaques that emphasized the military achievement without the ideological context. These commemorations were progressively removed or reviewed through the late 20th and early 21st centuries, as German society's standards for who deserved public commemoration became more carefully calibrated. The barracks that bore his name had their designation changed. The streets were renamed. The hero of Narvik was not erased from history. He remains in the history books, assessed honestly, but he was removed from the category of people whose names belong on the walls of public institutions. This, too, is a form of reckoning, and it is the right one. What remains of Dietl, stripped of the propaganda and the post-war controversy, is the memory of those weeks in the spring of 1940, a garrison in the mountains, cut off, under pressure, holding a position against considerable odds, through skill and stubborn endurance and a profound knowledge of difficult terrain. That achievement belongs to every man in that garrison, not just to the general who commanded them, the mountain soldiers who built the defensive positions, the stranded sailors who picked up infantry rifles and learned to hold ridgelines, the staff officers who improvised supply solutions under conditions that their training had never fully prepared them for. They were all part of what Narvik represented on the German side. Their professional quality was real, whatever the larger context of their service. And in the long accounting of the battle, that quality deserves its honest place in the record, neither glorified nor erased, but simply noted as a thing that happened in a specific place at a specific time, with consequences that outlasted all of them. Narvik itself, when Dietl's men came back to it in June 1940, was a damaged and diminished version of the town they had first occupied in April, but it was still there. The mountains were still there, the fjord was still there, and the ore railway, whose protection had set everything in motion, was already being repaired. The world had reorganized itself around this small harbour town's strategic position, and it would not be done with it yet. Chapter 14. The Exiled Fighters. To understand fully what the battle at Narvik meant, you have to follow not just the ships that sank and the mountains that were fought over, but the people who survived it and carried it with them into the years that followed. The Polish Independent Highland Brigade left Narvik's fjord in June 1940 and sailed back toward a Europe that was reorganizing itself in ways that made their situation uniquely painful. They had come from a country that no longer existed as a free state. Poland had been divided between Germany and the Soviet Union since September 1940, and the government they served was a government in exile, operating from London, commanding military forces that had been reconstituted from the fragments of defeat and the energy of a national identity too stubborn to accept its own erasure. Narvik had been their first fight against the Germans since the fall of Poland. It would not be their last. The brigade, numbering close to 5,000 men when it had sailed for Norway, returned to France in June 1940, arriving just in time for the final collapse of French organized resistance. The armistice of the 22nd of June effectively ended the campaign in France, and Polish forces in France faced the same choice that French soldiers faced: accept the occupation's terms or find a way to continue. The Polish brigade, like most organized Polish military units in France, chose to continue. They made their way to ports on the Atlantic coast and the Mediterranean, embarked on whatever vessels were available, and crossed to Britain in a second extraction that, for many of these men, felt like a repetition of a pattern they were becoming grimly expert at: fight, lose the ground they had fought for, embark, cross water, regroup, prepare to fight again. In Britain, the Polish forces were reconstituted within the larger structure of the Allied forces under British command. Polish pilots flew in the Battle of Britain, their performance so impressive that they became among the most celebrated units of that battle, their national determination expressing itself in the aggressive precision of their flying. Polish ground forces trained in Scotland, waiting for the opportunity to return to the continent. Polish warships, the destroyers and submarines of the Polish Navy that had escaped the September 1939 catastrophe, served alongside the Royal Navy across multiple theatres. The Polish contribution to the Allied war effort, measured against the size of the nation and the scale of what had been done to it, was extraordinary. But it was also a contribution made in the shadow of a specific anxiety that hung over every Polish soldier through all the years of the war: the question of what would happen to Poland when it was finally over. The answer that emerged from the Great Power negotiations at Tehran in 1943 and Yalta in 1945 was not the one that the Polish government in exile had fought for, or that the Polish soldiers who had bled at Narvik and in the subsequent campaigns had understood they were fighting for. The Yalta Conference, in February 1945, effectively assigned Poland to the Soviet sphere of influence, recognizing, as a practical reality, that Soviet forces would occupy the country when the war ended, and that the political system that emerged would be determined by Soviet preferences rather than by the democratic will of the Polish people. The government in exile, the government that the Polish soldiers at Narvik had served, was not recognized by the great powers as the legitimate government of post-war Poland. The Lublin Committee, Soviet-backed, was recognized instead. For the Polish soldiers in Britain, when this became clear, the calculation was devastating. They had fought for 6 years across multiple campaigns: Poland, France, Norway, the Western Desert, Italy, the Netherlands, Germany, in the service of a Poland that would be restored as a free and independent state. They had accepted loss after loss, displacement after displacement, with the understanding that the endurance was not permanent, that there was a Poland on the other side of the war that would welcome them home. The Yalta settlement told them that the Poland they had fought for was not the Poland that would exist. The choice facing each soldier was whether to return to a Soviet-dominated Poland, accepting whatever that meant for people who had fought under the Western Allied flag and served a government that Moscow regarded with hostility, or to remain in Britain, in exile, far from the country and the families that many of them had not seen in 6 years. Many chose to stay in Britain. The Polish Resettlement Corps, established in 1946, provided a framework for Polish soldiers who could not or would not return to Poland to transition into civilian life in Britain. These men settled in British cities and towns: London, Nottingham, Manchester, Edinburgh, and built lives in a country that was not theirs, speaking a language that most of them had not known 6 years earlier, maintaining Polish communities and Polish cultural institutions with the energy of people who could not go back. Some did return to Poland, accepting the risks. Some found their way to other countries, Canada, the United States, Australia, building the Polish diaspora communities that persist to this day. A very small number returned to Norway, drawn back to the country where they had first fought as exiles. The French Foreign Legion soldiers who had fought at Narvik faced a different set of choices, shaped by France's own internal divisions. The Legion, true to its traditions, served the legitimate French government, and the question of what constituted the legitimate French government was the defining political question of the French experience from June 1940 onward. Many legionnaires who had fought in Norway eventually found their way to the Free French forces under de Gaulle. Others ended up in units that took a different path through the confusion of the armistice and the collaboration years. The Legion fought on multiple fronts through the remaining years of the war, in North Africa, in Italy, in the south of France, in Germany. The men who had come ashore at Björkvik under fire in May 1940 were scattered by the war's subsequent movements, but the Legion itself continued, as the Legion always continues, absorbing the displacements of history and keeping its identity intact across them. The Norwegian soldiers who had fought at Narvik, those who had retaken their own town and then been told to leave it, continued the fight from Britain as well. The Free Norwegian forces, organised under the Norwegian government in exile, included ground troops, naval forces, and an air force. Norwegian pilots flew in the Battle of Britain and in subsequent air campaigns. Norwegian warships served in the Atlantic, the Arctic, and elsewhere. Norwegian special operations agents, many of them trained at camps in Scotland, returned to Norway in the years of the occupation to conduct the resistance work described in the previous chapter. The men who had fought at Narvik were part of a military tradition that maintained its continuity even when the country it represented was under occupation, a tradition that drew its legitimacy from the same source as the king's. Radio broadcasts, the insistence that what Norway was did not depend on what Germany had temporarily made of it. The Norwegian merchant sailors deserve a particular paragraph of their own, separate from the military forces, because their experience has a different quality. They were not soldiers or sailors in the formal military sense. They were civilian mariners who continued to operate their ships in Allied service throughout the war, carrying supplies across sea lanes that German submarines hunted continuously. Their mortality rate was extraordinarily high. Close to 4,000 Norwegian merchant sailors died during the war, a figure that, for a merchant marine of the size of Norway's and a population of the size of Norway's, represented a level of sacrifice that is difficult to fully comprehend outside the context of a nation at war for its survival. These men did not carry rifles or fire torpedoes. They carried cargoes of oil and food and ammunition across the North Atlantic and the Arctic approaches in weather that was frequently dangerous in itself and in the company of submarines that were looking for exactly them. Their courage was of a different kind from the mountain soldiers and the destroyer commanders, but it was not less. All of these threads, the Polish soldiers who stayed in Britain, the Free Norwegian forces, the Legion men scattered across the subsequent campaigns, the merchant sailors on the Atlantic convoys were part of the long consequence of what had happened at Narvik in the spring of 1940. The battle had expelled them from a place they had briefly held. The war had carried them in different directions. And when it was finally over, the reunion with home for those fortunate enough to have a home to return to was never simply a return. It was an arrival in a place that had changed, by someone who had also changed, with a gap of years between them that could be described but never fully closed. Chapter 15. The Civilians Who Waited. Wars are described, most often, in the language of armies and navies, of strategy and tactics, of the men who gave orders and the men who carried them out. This language is useful and necessary, but it leaves out a dimension of the experience that was, for the largest number of people involved, the most immediate reality. The experience of the civilians who did not choose the war, who had no part in the decisions that started it or the strategies that directed it, and who endured it in their homes and their streets and their daily lives, as something done to them rather than something they were doing. At Narvik, the civilian experience of the Second World War ran from the 9th of April 1940 to the 8th of May 1945, 5 years and a month, and it was shaped at every point by the specific characteristics of a place that had become, through no choice of its residents, one of the most strategically significant locations in the Northern Hemisphere. The population of Narvik in 1940 was small, a few thousand people, with the town supplemented by workers connected to the ore loading operations and the railway. When the German destroyers arrived in the early hours of the 9th of April, the response of the civilian population was the response of people who have had no time to prepare for what is happening to them. Disorientation, fear, the rapid search for information in the absence of any reliable information, and the instinctive gathering of family in whatever shelter seemed most protected. The Norwegian military garrison offered what resistance it could. The Eidsvold and the Norge, 2 Norwegian coastal defence vessels, engaged the German destroyers in the harbour and were sunk, with the loss of most of their crews. The town fell within hours. The civilians who had heard the sound of guns from their windows and cellars emerged cautiously into a morning that looked like their town but was already something else. The weeks of the campaign, the naval battles, the Allied build-up, the artillery exchanges that preceded the final Allied assault were experienced by the civilian population as a condition of sustained danger in which the distinction between combatant and non-combatant was, at the level of a shell falling on a residential street, largely irrelevant. People sheltered where they could, in the more solid buildings of the town centre, in the hillside terrain above the harbour, in improvised positions in the areas less directly in the line of fire. Some evacuated to the surrounding countryside or to neighbouring settlements. Some chose to stay in their homes because they had nowhere else to go, or because the attachment to place that people feel in crisis kept them there. The town they sheltered in was being progressively damaged by the fighting that surrounded it, and the sound of that fighting was the constant background to whatever ordinary life continued. The German occupation that settled over Narvik after June 1940 had the particular character of a military occupation in a strategically vital location. The ore facilities and the railway were the primary concern of the German administration, and the civilian population's relationship to these facilities, whether they worked in them, whether they were near them, whether their daily routines intersected with the German military activities centered on them, shaped what the occupation meant in practice for individual families. Those who worked in essential industries that the occupation required continued to work under the supervision of German industrial management. Those whose livelihoods were in fishing or small commerce continued those activities within the regulations the occupation imposed. Everyone operated within a framework of restrictions on movement, communication, and association that contracted the space of daily life in ways that accumulated over years into a profound deprivation of ordinary freedom. The families of men who were in the resistance, whether the men themselves were in Norway conducting clandestine activities or abroad in the exiled armed forces, lived with a specific anxiety that was different in kind from the tendy, general anxiety of the occupation. They knew, or suspected, what their fathers or sons or husbands were doing, and they knew what the consequences of discovery would be. The Gestapo's presence in occupied Norway was not comprehensive in the way that it was in some other occupied territories, but it was real enough, and its methods were known well enough, that the knowledge of it shaped behaviour in concrete ways. People spoke carefully. They chose their confidences with attention. They maintained surfaces of ordinary life that were designed, among other things, to provide no visible indication to any observer that the household they were observing had anything to hide. The Jewish community of Norway, roughly 2,000 people in total, experienced the occupation's progression from general restriction to specific persecution and finally to deportation, with a clarity that the rest of the population understood incompletely until it was happening. The anti-Jewish regulations that the occupation introduced progressively from 1940 onward, identification requirements, restrictions on professions and economic activity, were visible to everyone, but perhaps not, in the early stages, fully legible as the steps toward something catastrophic that they in fact were. When the deportations came in the autumn of 1942, organized by Norwegian police under German direction. With transports to the death camps of the east, the Norwegian Jewish community was effectively destroyed. The majority of those deported did not return. The communities they had been part of in Oslo, in Trondheim, in the smaller towns where Jewish families had lived for generations were emptied. The post-war reckoning with this chapter of the occupation, including the role of Norwegian state institutions in facilitating it, was slow and incomplete and has been revisited repeatedly in the decades since, each revisiting somewhat more honest than the last. The children who grew up in Narvik and in occupied Norway during the war years grew up inside a condition of normalcy within oppression that the human capacity for adaptation made livable at the daily level, even as it was objectively extraordinary. They went to schools whose curriculum had been reshaped by the occupation's ideological program, though the teachers' resistance of 1941 and 42 had blunted the most extreme elements of this reshaping. They played in streets that had German soldiers on them. They understood, at whatever level children understand such things, that the world they inhabited was not the world it was supposed to be. The Norwegian language was their native language, and their culture was Norwegian, and no occupation could reach far enough inside a child's daily life to change that, no matter how comprehensive the administrative machinery around them. This is what made the occupation ultimately a failure in its deepest ambition. The attempt to reshape Norwegian identity never reached the children playing in the streets, who grew up Norwegian in spite of everything. The end of the occupation in May 1945 was received by the civilian population with the particular intensity of people who have been waiting for something for 5 years and have never quite let themselves believe it was actually going to arrive. The German surrender was announced on the 8th of May 1945, a date that Norway celebrates to this day as Liberation Day. In Narvik and across Norway, the reaction was immediate and physical. People came into the streets, flags appeared from places where they had been hidden through the occupation years. The Norwegian red, white and blue was visible everywhere almost instantaneously, as if the country had been waiting with its arms full of flags for exactly this moment. The occupation that had begun with destroyers in the harbour in the dark of an April morning ended with people in the streets in the light of a May evening, and the relief was proportional to the weight of what it was relieving. The Norwegian soldiers and sailors and resistance fighters who came home, those who survived, came home to a Norway that had endured and was intact in the most important senses. Its government was restored, its king was returning, its language and culture had not been absorbed into the occupation's framework despite 5 years of effort. The physical damage was real and significant, particularly in the north, where the German withdrawal from Finnmark in the autumn and winter of 1944-45 had been accompanied by a scorched earth destruction of the civilian infrastructure houses, farms, roads, bridges that left an entire region without habitable shelter in an Arctic winter. The reconstruction of Finnmark was one of the largest and most urgent civil works projects in Norway's post-war history. But the damage was to buildings, to infrastructure, to property. What the occupation had tried to damage the identity and coherence of the Norwegian people was, against all expectation, essentially intact. The civilians who had waited through 5 years in the dark had held something that had no formal military value and could not be defended by any weapon. They had held the ordinary, daily reality of who they were, the language, the culture, the habits, the values, the sense of belonging to a specific place and a specific community against a systematic effort to dissolve all of it. The victory was not dramatic. It had no single moment, no climactic battle, no flag raised on a particular hill. It was a victory of persistence, accumulated day by day across 5 years, maintained in the spaces between the occupation's machinery, in the kitchens and the schools and the illegal newspaper networks and the hidden radios tuned to the king's voice. It was the quietest and in some ways the most complete victory of the entire Norwegian campaign. Chapter 16. The Liberation and the Return of the King. The liberation of Norway was not a single event, but a process that unfolded over the final months of the war and reached its formal conclusion on the 8th of May, 1945, when Germany's unconditional surrender ended the occupation everywhere simultaneously. But within that process, certain moments carried particular symbolic and historical weight, and none more so than the return of King Haakon VII to Norwegian soil on the 7th of June, 1945, exactly 5 years to the day after he had left it aboard a British vessel, carrying the Norwegian government into the exile from which it had never ceased to govern. The timing of the king's return was not accidental. The 7th of June held significance in Norwegian constitutional history independent of the Second World War. It was the date in 1905 on which Norway had formally dissolved its union with Sweden and asserted its full independence as a sovereign nation. By choosing this date for his return in 1945, Haakon and his government were drawing a deliberate line of continuity, from the independence of 1905 through the occupation and the exile to the restoration of the free Norwegian state. The message was that the 5 years had been a parenthesis, a forced interruption in a story of Norwegian sovereignty that resumed in 1945 exactly where it had been interrupted in 1940, without any loss of the constitutional identity that had been the occupation's deepest target. The reception that greeted the king's return was, by all contemporary accounts, one of the most emotionally charged popular demonstrations in Norwegian history. Crowds gathered in Oslo along the route from the harbour to the palace in numbers that exceeded anything the city had seen in peacetime. People who had maintained, through 5 years of occupation, the careful composure required to survive in a controlled environment, shed that composure entirely in the hours of the return. There were accounts of people weeping in the streets without self-consciousness, of veterans of the resistance and of the foreign campaigns embracing strangers, of an entire population releasing, in the hours of one day, the compressed weight of 5 years of sustained endurance. The king, who was 67 years old and had spent those 5 years in London maintaining the dignity and continuity of the Norwegian state through diplomatic work and public radio addresses, walked through those crowds with the solemnity and the visible emotion of a man who had never fully believed he would see exactly this. The situation in Finnmark, the northernmost part of Norway, bordering Finland and the Soviet Union, was an exception to the pattern of liberation that applied to the rest of the country. German forces in Finnmark had not simply retreated as the war ended. In the autumn and winter of 1944, as Soviet forces advanced from the east into Finnish Lapland and then crossed into Norwegian territory, the German command had ordered a systematic destruction of the civilian infrastructure as they withdrew. Every house, every farm building, every road bridge, every boat that could not be taken along was destroyed. The civilian population, tens of thousands of people, was forcibly evacuated, some by German order and some by their own initiative ahead of the retreating German forces. What was left behind was a landscape from which everything human had been removed, the buildings burned to the ground, the livestock driven away, the wells poisoned. It was one of the most comprehensive acts of military scorched earth destruction carried out in Western Europe during the Second World War. Soviet forces liberated the easternmost part of Finnmark, the area around Kirkenes, in October 1944, and their arrival was received with the relief that any liberation brings, even when the liberating force carries its own complications. The Soviet forces that entered Finnmark were operating under the agreement that their advance into Norwegian territory was temporary. They would assist in the liberation and then withdraw, leaving Norwegian sovereignty intact. This agreement was honoured. Soviet forces withdrew from Norwegian territory in September 1945, and their departure confirmed that the post-war settlement would not, in Norway's case, produce the kind of Soviet sphere outcome that had been imposed on the countries of Eastern Europe. Norway would remain in the Western orientation that its government had maintained throughout the exile years, and this orientation would later find formal expression in Norway's membership in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization from its founding in 1949. The reconstruction of Norway after the liberation was an enormous undertaking, particularly in the north. Finnmark had to be rebuilt essentially, from nothing, every habitable structure destroyed, the population dispersed and needing to be resettled, the basic infrastructure of a functioning civilian society reconstructed in one of the most geographically demanding regions of Europe. The Norwegian government committed substantial resources to this reconstruction, and it proceeded with the energy that newly restored nations characteristically bring to the work of rebuilding. New houses were built, often in the prefabricated styles that could be assembled quickly in difficult conditions. Roads were repaired, harbours were reconstructed. The fishing communities that had existed before the German destruction were gradually restored, though the process took years and never completely replicated what had been lost. At Narvik specifically, the post-war reconstruction had to address the damage that 7 weeks of battle and 5 years of occupation had accumulated in a town whose infrastructure had been strained by the military use to which it had been put. The ore loading facilities, the entire reason the Germans had come, were rebuilt and restored to operation. The town itself was gradually reconstructed, the buildings damaged in the battle replaced by the modernist architecture that characterized Norwegian post-war construction, practical and plain, and designed for the climate rather than for visual effect. The fjord remained, of course, the mountains, and the water that had given the place its character were not subject to reconstruction. They were simply there, as they had always been, indifferent to the human drama that had been conducted in their presence. The German war graves in Narvik were a particular post-war consideration. The men who had died in the battles in the mountains and the fjord, German soldiers, German sailors from the sunken destroyers, were eventually interred at the German War Cemetery at Narvik, established and maintained by the German War Graves Commission. This cemetery, situated on a hillside above the town, with a view across the fjord toward the mountains where the fighting had taken place, became over the post-war decades a place that drew both German visitors seeking the graves of relatives and Norwegian visitors confronting the complexity of what it means to honor the dead of an occupying force that had caused such suffering. War cemeteries are always complicated spaces. They are places of genuine grief for the families of the dead, existing in the same landscape as the places where those deaths caused suffering to others. Narvik's German cemetery contains both of those truths simultaneously, and visitors who approach it thoughtfully tend to leave with more questions than they arrived with. The Norwegian soldiers and sailors and resistance fighters who had died in the defense of their country were commemorated through a network of memorials established across Norway in the post-war years, monuments at the sites of battles, plaques on the walls of buildings where resistance work had been conducted, memorial stones for the merchant sailors at harbours along the Norwegian coast. The war memorial culture that emerged in Norway in the decades after 1945 was, like similar cultures in other occupied countries, an attempt to give public form to a grief and a pride that were both genuine and complicated. The occupied country's relationship to its own wartime experience is never simple. It must hold together the memory of resistance and the memory of collaboration. The heroes and the bystanders and the people who made choices under pressure that they themselves found difficult to justify in the calmer atmosphere of peace. Norwegian memorial culture has, over the decades, become increasingly honest about this complexity. The king, who had returned in June 1945, lived until 1957, reigning over a post-war Norway that was rebuilding its economy, re-establishing its institutions, and taking its place in the new international order of the Cold War period. He had been 77 years old when he died, having served as Norway's king for 52 years through the country's most challenging decades. His return in 1945 and the continuity it represented, the unbroken line from the constitutional Norway of 1905 through the occupation and back, was the founding act of post-war Norwegian national identity. Narvik had been where the fight for Norway had been most intense and most visible to the outside world. Oslo, in June of 1945, was where the Norway that had endured all of it came back to itself. Chapter 17. The Wrecks, the Museums, and the Memory. 60 years of saltwater and slow pressure have changed the wrecks in Ofotfjord, but not beyond recognition. The 10 German destroyers that went to the bottom between the 9th and 13th of April, 1940, sit at various depths along the fjord, some in the main channel, some in the side fjords where the final German destroyers made their last rearguard retreats in conditions that the cold, deep water of a Norwegian fjord tends to preserve better than warmer or shallower seas. Divers who have descended to these wrecks in the decades since the war have described the experience in terms that share a consistent texture: the approach through darkening water, the moment when the shape of a hull resolves out of the blue-green depths, the particular silence of machinery that was once loud and purposeful now stilled permanently, the fish that have made homes in the structures, indifferent to what those structures once were. The Norwegian Navy has designated the wrecks as protected heritage sites, which means that while diving is permitted under controlled conditions, the removal of any material is prohibited. The wrecks belong to the sea and to the historical record simultaneously, and that dual ownership has been taken seriously by the Norwegian authorities responsible for managing Norway's underwater cultural heritage. This management reflects a broader Norwegian cultural commitment to the physical preservation of the war's material evidence, a commitment that expresses itself above water as well as below, in the museums and memorial sites that have grown up around Narvik in the decades since the war ended. The Narvik War Museum Kriegsmarine is the primary institution through which the story of the 1940 campaign is preserved and interpreted for visitors. Established in the post-war decades and developed through subsequent generations of curatorial work, the museum holds a collection of artifacts, documents, photographs, and personal testimonies that together constitute one of the most comprehensive public records of the Norwegian campaign in any language. The collection includes material from all sides of the conflict: Norwegian, British, German, French, Polish, and the curatorial approach has become, over time, increasingly attentive to the civilian experience of the occupation alongside the military narrative of the battles. This broadening reflects the general evolution of war museum practice across the late 20th and early 21st centuries, away from an exclusive focus on military hardware and toward an engagement with the full human experience of conflict. The physical landscape around Narvik has been developed with care as a heritage space that allows visitors to walk the ground on which the fighting took place. The mountainous terrain that shaped the battle so completely is still there, unchanged in its essential character: the same ridgelines, the same views down into the fjord, the same distances between positions that made the fighting so costly and so prolonged. Walking these ridgelines, visitors can understand in a physical and immediate way what the tactical accounts describe in text. The degree to which this terrain amplified the advantage of the defender, the exposure of any attacking force moving up open slopes toward prepared positions, the importance of the few paths and ridges that allowed movement in any direction without crossing open ground. The landscape is the best explanation of why the battle lasted as long as it did. The film about the Norwegian campaign, the Norwegian production, released in 2022, titled simply Narvik, and focusing specifically on the civilian and military experience of the 1940 battle through the perspective of Norwegian characters, introduced the battle to a new generation of viewers internationally through its international release on streaming platforms. The film made a conscious choice to tell the story from the Norwegian perspective, the perspective of the people whose country was being fought over, rather than from the British or German perspectives that have tended to dominate English-language accounts of the campaign. It was received with considerable attention in Norway and in the international market for Second World War historical drama, and it prompted new interest in the history of the 1940 campaign among audiences who had not previously engaged with it. For the town of Narvik, the film's international release brought a wave of historical tourism that demonstrated how cultural production and heritage management can reinforce each other productively. The annual commemorations at Narvik held in May, on the anniversary of the Allied recapture of the town, bring together Norwegian veterans organizations, representatives of the nations whose forces fought in the campaign, and members of the public for ceremonies that have evolved over the decades, from the immediate post-war generation's direct memorial grief into the more complex historical reflection appropriate to a time when the last veterans are gone and the war has passed fully into history. The May commemorations include wreath laying at the various national war graves in and around Narvik, the Norwegian memorial, the German cemetery. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission plots where British soldiers and sailors are buried, and the simultaneous presence of these national grave sites in the same small town creates, for thoughtful visitors, an unusually compressed encounter with the multinational nature of the battle and the loss it produced on every side. The Ofotfjord Railway, the railway that was the entire reason Narvik existed as a strategic location, the railway that the Germans came to secure and that Dietl's garrison fought to hold, is still in operation today. It runs from Narvik through the mountains to Kiruna in Sweden, and it carries iron ore from the same mines that were producing ore in 1940, loaded at the same harbour that the German destroyers occupied in April of that year. The economic logic that made Narvik strategically vital in 1940 has not disappeared. The ore still moves. The harbour is still ice-free. The railway is still the connection between the mines and the sea. The difference is that this movement of ore now takes place within the framework of peaceful European commerce, without the weight of strategic competition and military occupation that once made it the pivot point of a world at war. The railway that caused everything runs today as a tourist attraction, as well as an industrial artery. Visitors can take the journey from Narvik to Kiruna, specifically to experience the mountain scenery and the historical resonance of the route. The scenery is exactly as striking as the soldiers on both sides recorded it being. The underwater wrecks have become, in addition to heritage sites, one of the world's more unusual diving destinations. The combination of historically significant material, good preservation conditions, and the dramatic scenery of the fjord makes the wreck diving at Narvik an experience sought by recreational and technical divers from across Europe and beyond. Dive operations based at Narvik offer guided descents to the more accessible wrecks, with briefings that cover both the diving conditions and the historical context who these ships were, what happened to them, whose sons and brothers went down with them. The guides who conduct these briefings work from the historical record with care, and the combination of physical encounter with the actual wrecks and accurate historical context produces, by accounts of those who have experienced it, a kind of understanding that reading alone cannot fully replicate. You can read about 10 destroyers lost in a fjord. You can understand it differently when you can see the hull in front of you, in the cold, dark water, perfectly still. The memory of Narvik has also been carried across the generations by families, the families of the men who fought there on every side, Norwegian and British and German and Polish and French, who passed the story down through grandparents' accounts and letters and photographs, through the particular family knowledge that is different in texture from anything found in a history book. These family memories are imprecise in the ways that personal recollection is always imprecise, selective in the way that people select what is bearable to remember from what they have experienced, and emotionally vivid in the way that inherited grief always is. They are also, in aggregate, a historical resource of extraordinary richness, a counterweight to the official records and the strategic analyses, a reminder that every name in the casualty lists was a person whose absence reshaped a specific family's experience of everything that followed. The British families who received the telegrams in April and June of 1940, the families of the men aboard HMS Hardy and HMS Hunter, the families of those lost on Glorious and Ardent and Acasta, are now in their third and fourth generation of distance from the loss. But the names on the Commonwealth War Graves Commission memorials remain, maintained with the particular care for which that organisation is rightly celebrated, ensuring that each of those men is still findable by name, still placed in a specific location, still connected to a specific act of service. Warburton Lee's Victoria Cross is held in a naval museum. His grave where the beached HMS Hardy came to rest and where he died of his wounds is in Norway, maintained as part of the War Graves Network, 4,000 kilometres from the English county where he was born. His story and the fjord where he made his decision are part of each other permanently. Chapter 18. The Meaning of Narvik. At the end of a long journey through history, it is tempting to arrive at tidy conclusions, to tie the threads together in a way that gives the whole story a moral, a lesson, a reason why it had to be told at this length, and in this detail. But Narvik resists that kind of tidiness, and the resistance is honest rather than evasive. The battle that happened here in the spring of 1940 was not a story with a clean message. It was a story with multiple competing truths, some of them uncomfortable, many of them unresolved, all of them more complex than any single interpretation can contain. That complexity is not a weakness in the story, it is the source of its continuing relevance. The strategic truth of Narvik is this: the battle achieved its objectives for neither side in the way that the planners had anticipated. Germany secured the iron ore route and held Norway. Those were the intended objectives of Operation Weserübung, and by those measures the operation succeeded. But the naval cost of that success broke the Kriegsmarine surface forces in ways that constrained German strategic options for the remainder of the war. The destroyers lost at Narvik reached forward and closed doors that Germany needed open. The ore kept moving, but the fleet that had been sent to secure it could not perform the other functions a fleet is needed for. The trade ore route secured, destroyer fleet shattered, was not one that Raeder would have accepted if he had known the full cost in advance. And the British, who failed to prevent the German occupation and were eventually forced to evacuate their forces from Norwegian territory, inflicted in those same waters a naval wound that had consequences far exceeding the operational failure of the Norwegian campaign. Both sides achieved and lost things they had not fully intended. This is how many of history's important battles actually work. The human truth of Narvik is harder to summarize and more important than the strategic one. The men who died in Ofotfjord in the destroyer actions of April, in the harbour approaches and the mountain ridgelines, in the evacuation at sea died in water that was genuinely cold and in circumstances that were genuinely terrifying, for reasons they understood to different degrees and with varying conviction. They were not abstractions. They were specific people with specific skills and specific relationships and specific ideas about what they were doing and why. Warburton Lee, who decided to go in anyway. The German sailors whose ships sank before they could refuel and sail home. The Polish soldiers who fought for a Poland they would not be allowed to return to. The Norwegian farmers' sons who held ridgelines above their own country. Each of them carried into the battle a specific life that the battle either ended or permanently altered, and the aggregation of those specific lives is what the strategic narrative is actually built from, even when the strategic narrative forgets to say so. The Norwegian truth of Narvik is perhaps the most layered of all. Norway was a country that had maintained neutrality through the First World War and had approached the Second with the reasonable hope that neutrality might again be possible. The German invasion of the 9th of April destroyed that hope in a single morning, and the 5 years that followed showed the Norwegian people what it meant to have that hope destroyed, what occupation costs. In daily life, in individual courage, in the specific sacrifices required to maintain a national identity under systematic pressure, the resistance that emerged, the government that continued in exile, the king who returned, the civilians who waited and endured and maintained the ordinary fabric of Norwegian culture through 5 years of suppression. These constitute a national story that Norway has told itself in multiple forms through the decades, since, and has never finished telling. Because the questions it raises about identity and resistance and complicity and courage are questions that every generation needs to ask for itself. The physical place that this story happened in is still there. The fjord is still there. The mountains are still there. The wrecks are still there. The ore railway is still running. The museum is still open. The grave of Warburton Lee is still maintained in the cold Norwegian ground. The German cemetery on the hill still has its view across the water to the mountains. These physical presences are the argument against the forgetting that long wars eventually impose the argument that says, this happened here, to specific people, in a specific place, with consequences that reached across years and across the whole geography of the war. The place itself is a kind of evidence, offered to anyone willing to make the journey north. History is not a series of clean lessons. If it were, the same kinds of events would not recur in the ways that they demonstrably do. History is, more honestly, a record of what humans are capable of in the full range of that capability, from the worst to something approaching the best, and of the circumstances that call different parts of that capability forward. The Battle of Narvik called forward courage and calculation, cruelty and endurance, extraordinary individual decision-making, and collective institutional failure, strategic genius and strategic catastrophe, resistance that lasted 5 years, and collaboration that lasted just as long. All of these were present simultaneously, in the same small town at the top of the world, across the same weeks and years. The sleep audience that has travelled through these 18 chapters from the iron ore politics of 1939 to the museums and the wrecks of the present day has spent time in a corner of the war that most accounts rush past or skip entirely. That time is worth something, even if its value is hard to specify precisely. Knowing Narvik, knowing what happened there, who was there, what the terrain looked like, how the decisions were made, what the consequences were, does not make the world simpler. It makes it more accurate. And accuracy, in the treatment of the past, is the form of respect that history most requires. The 10 destroyers at the bottom of Ofotfjord do not ask for anything. They are beyond asking. They are simply there, in the cold, dark water, in the silence that follows every storm, in the presence of the mountains that have watched this fjord for longer than any human memory can reach. The fish move through them. The cold current shifts them, infinitesimally, across the decades. The silt of the fjord continues its slow work of filling in the spaces that machinery once occupied. And somewhere above them, on the surface that changes with every season, boats still cross the water, fishing boats and ferries, and the occasional dive vessel lowering someone carefully into the past, and the mountains watch, as they have always watched. And the ore trains still run through the mountain, and the town goes on. The battle is over. The story is not. Thank you for watching. If this documentary was part of your night, whether you were awake for all of it, or let it carry you into sleep somewhere along the way, we are genuinely glad it was here. The Battle of Narvik is one of the most consequential and least told stories of the entire Second World War, and it deserved this kind of telling. If it moved you, please subscribe, leave a comment, and share it with someone who would want to take this journey. And if there is another long-form history you would like to see made a battle, a campaign, a chapter of the war that you feel has never been told at the depth it deserves, tell us in the comments below. We will be back, in the dark, with another story.